Barsoom Series, Book 3, Part 1, by Edgar Rice Burroughs, The Warlord of Mars, the end of original John Carter trilogy. Let a world's most beautiful woman share the honor of her husband. Chapter 1. On the River Iss. In the shadows of the forest that flanks the Crimson Plain, by the side of the lost Sea of Chorus, in the valley door, beneath the hurtling moons of Mars, speeding their meteoric way close above the bosom of the dying planet, I crept stealthily along the trail of a shadowy form that hugged the darker places with a persistency that proclaimed the sinister nature of its errand. For 6 long Martian months, I had haunted the vicinity of the hateful Temple of the Sun, within whose slow revolving shaft, far beneath the surface of Mars, my princess lay entombed, but whether alive or dead I knew not. Had Fedor's slim blade found that beloved heart, time only would reveal the truth. 687 Martian days must come and go before the cell's door would again come opposite the tunnel's end, where last I had seen my ever-beautiful Dejah Thoris. Half of them had passed, or would on the morrow, yet vivid in my memory, obliterating every event that had come before or after. There remained the last scene before the gust of smoke blinded my eyes, and the narrow slit that had given me sight of the interior of her cell closed between me and the Princess of Helium for a long Martian year. As if it were yesterday, I still saw the beautiful face of Fedor, daughter of Mad-Eye Shang, distorted with jealous rage and hatred as she sprang forward with raised dagger upon the woman I loved. I saw the red girl, Thuvia of Tarth, leap forward to prevent the hideous deed. The smoke from the burning temple had come then to blot out the tragedy, but in my ears rang the single shriek as the knife fell. Then silence, and when the smoke had cleared, the revolving temple had shut off all sight or sound from the chamber in which the 3 beautiful women were imprisoned. Much there had been to occupy my attention since that terrible moment, but never for an instant had the memory of the thing faded, and all the time that I could spare from the numerous duties that had devolved upon me in the reconstruction of the government of the firstborn, since our victorious fleet and land forces had overwhelmed them, had been spent close to the grim shaft that held the mother of my boy, Thoris of Helium. The race of blacks that for ages had worshipped Isis, the false deity of Mars, had been left in a state of chaos by my revealment of her as naught more than a wicked old woman. In their rage they had torn her to pieces. From the high pinnacle of their egotism, the firstborn had been plunged to the depths of humiliation. Their deity was gone, and with her the whole false fabric of their religion. Their vaunted navy had fallen in defeat before the superior ships and fighting men of the Red Men of Helium. Fierce green warriors from the Asher sea bottoms of outer Mars had ridden their wild thoats across the sacred gardens of the Temple of Isis, and Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, fiercest of them all, had sat upon the throne of Isis and ruled the firstborn while the allies were deciding the conquered nation's fate. Almost unanimous was the request that I ascend the ancient throne of the black men, even the firstborn themselves concurring in it. But I would have none of it. My heart could never be with the race that had heaped indignities upon my princess and my son. At my suggestion, Zadar became Jeddak of the firstborn. He had been a Dejah, or prince, until Isis had degraded him, so that his fitness for the high office bestowed was unquestioned. The peace of the valley door thus assured, the green warriors dispersed to their desolate sea bottoms, while we of Helium returned to our own country. Here again was a throne offered me, since no word had been received from the missing Jeddak of Helium, Tardos Mors, grandfather of Dejah Thoris, or his son, Mors Kajak, Jed of Helium, her father. Over a year had elapsed since they had set out to explore the northern hemisphere in search of Thoris, and at last the disheartened people had accepted as truth the vague rumors of their death that had filtered in from the frozen region of the pole. Once again I refused a throne, for I would not believe that the mighty Tardos Mors, or his no less redoubtable son, was dead. Let one of their own blood rule you until they return, I said to the assembled nobles of Helium, as I addressed them from the pedestal of truth beside the throne of righteousness in the temple of reward, from the very spot where I had stood a year before when Zataraz pronounced the sentence of death upon me. As I spoke, I stepped forward and laid my hand upon the shoulder of Thoris, where he stood in the front rank of the circle of nobles about me. As one, the nobles and the people lifted their voices in a long cheer of approbation. 10,000 swords sprang on high from as many scabbards, and the glorious fighting men of ancient Helium hailed Thoris Jedak of Helium. His tenure of office was to be for life, or until his great-grandfather or grandfather should return. Having thus satisfactorily arranged this important duty for Helium, I started the following day for the valley door that I might remain close to the Temple of the Sun, until the fateful day that should see the opening of the prison cell where my lost love lay buried. Hor Vastus and Cantos Can, with my other noble lieutenants, I left with Thoris at Helium, that he might have the benefit of their wisdom, bravery, and loyalty in the performance of the arduous duties which had devolved upon him. Only Wooler, my Martian hound, accompanied me. At my heels tonight the faithful beast moved softly in my tracks. As large as a Shetland pony, with hideous head and frightful fangs, he was indeed an awesome spectacle, as he crept after me on his 10 short, muscular legs. But to me he was the embodiment of love and loyalty. The figure ahead was that of the black Dejah of the firstborn, Thurid, whose undying enmity I had earned that time. I laid him low with my bare hands in the courtyard of the temple of Issus, and bound him with his own harness before the noble men and women who had but a moment before been extolling his prowess. Like many of his fellows, he had apparently accepted the new order of things with good grace, and had sworn fealty to Zadar, his new ruler. But I knew that he hated me, and I was sure that in his heart he envied and hated Zadar, so I had kept a watch upon his comings and goings, to the end that of late I had become convinced that he was occupied with some manner of intrigue. Several times I had observed him leaving the walled city of the firstborn after dark, taking his way out into the cruel and horrible valley door, where no honest business could lead any man. Tonight he moved quickly along the edge of the forest, until well beyond sight or sound of the city. Then he turned across the crimson sward toward the shore of the lost Sea of Chorus. The rays of the nearer moon, swinging low across the valley, touched his jewel-encrusted harness with 1,000 changing lights, and glanced from the glossy ebony of his smooth hide. Twice he turned his head back toward the forest, after the manner of one who is upon an evil errand, though he must have felt quite safe from pursuit. I did not dare follow him there beneath the moonlight, since it best suited my plans not to interrupt his. I wished him to reach his destination unsuspecting, that I might learn just where that destination lay and the business that awaited the night prowler there. So it was that I remained hidden until after Thurid had disappeared over the edge of the steep bank beside the sea 1/4 of a mile away. Then, with Wooler following, I hastened across the open after the black Dejah. The quiet of the tomb lay upon the mysterious valley of death, crouching deep in its warm nest within the sunken area at the south pole of the dying planet. In the far distance, the golden cliffs raised their mighty barrier faces far into the starlit heavens, the precious metals and scintillating jewels that composed them sparkling in the brilliant light of Mars's 2 gorgeous moons. At my back was the forest, pruned and trimmed like the sward to park-like symmetry by the browsing of the ghoulish plant men. Before me lay the lost Sea of Chorus, while farther on I caught the shimmering ribbon of Iss, the river of mystery, where it wound out from beneath the golden cliffs to empty into Chorus, to which for countless ages had been borne the deluded and unhappy Martians of the outer world upon the voluntary pilgrimage to this false heaven. The plant men, with their blood-sucking hands, and the monstrous white apes that make Dor hideous by day, were hidden in their lairs for the night. There was no longer a holy thurn upon the balcony in the golden cliffs above the Iss to summon them, with a weird cry to the victims floating down to their maws upon the cold, broad bosom of ancient Iss. The navies of Helium and the firstborn had cleared the fortresses and the temples of the Therns when they had refused to surrender and accept the new order of things that had swept their false religion from long-suffering Mars. In a few isolated countries they still retained their age-old power, but Mad-Eye Shang, their Hecador, father of Therns, had been driven from his temple. Strenuous had been our endeavors to capture him, but with a few of the faithful he had escaped and was in hiding where we knew not. As I came cautiously to the edge of the low cliff, overlooking the lost Sea of Chorus, I saw Thurid pushing out upon the bosom of the shimmering water in a small skiff, one of those strangely wrought craft of unthinkable age which the holy Therns, with their organization of priests and lesser Therns, were wont to distribute along the banks of the Iss, that the long journey of their victims might be facilitated. Drawn up on the beach below me were a score of similar boats, each with its long pole, at one end of which was a pike, at the other a paddle. Thurid was hugging the shore, and as he passed out of sight round a nearby promontory, I shoved one of the boats into the water and, calling Wooler into it, pushed out from shore. The pursuit of Thurid carried me along the edge of the sea toward the mouth of the Iss. The farther moon lay close to the horizon, casting a dense shadow beneath the cliffs that fringed the water. Thuria, the nearer moon, had set, nor would it rise again for near 4 hours, so that I was insured concealing darkness for that length of time at least. On and on went the black warrior. Now he was opposite the mouth of the Iss. Without an instant's hesitation, he turned up the grim river, paddling hard against the strong current. After him came Wooler and I, closer now, for the man was too intent upon forcing his craft up the river to have any eyes for what might be transpiring behind him. He hugged the shore where the current was less strong. Presently he came to the dark, cavernous portal in the face of the golden cliffs, through which the river poured. On into the Stygian darkness beyond he urged his craft. It seemed hopeless to attempt to follow him here where I could not see my hand before my face, and I was almost on the point of giving up the pursuit and drifting back to the mouth of the river, there to await his return, when a sudden bend showed a faint luminosity ahead. My quarry was plainly visible again, and in the increasing light from the phosphorescent rock that lay embedded in great patches in the roughly arched roof of the cavern, I had no difficulty in following him. It was my first trip upon the bosom of Iss, and the things I saw there will live forever in my memory. Terrible as they were, they could not have commenced to approximate the horrible conditions which must have obtained before Tarkas, the great green warrior, Zadar, the black Dejah, and I brought the light of truth to the outer world, and stopped the mad rush of millions upon the voluntary pilgrimage to what they believed would end in a beautiful valley of peace and happiness and love. Even now, the low islands which dotted the broad stream were choked with the skeletons and half-devoured carcasses of those who, through fear or a sudden awakening to the truth, had halted almost at the completion of their journey. In the awful stench of these frightful charnel isles, haggard maniacs screamed and gibbered and fought among the torn remnants of their grisly feasts, while on those which contained but clean-picked bones they battled with one another, the weaker furnishing sustenance for the stronger, or with claw-like hands clutched at the bloated bodies that drifted down with the current. Thurid paid not the slightest attention to the screaming things that either menaced or pleaded with him as the mood directed them. Evidently, he was familiar with the horrid sights that surrounded him. He continued up the river for perhaps a mile, and then, crossing over to the left bank, drew his craft up on a low ledge that lay almost on a level with the water. I dared not follow across the stream, for he most surely would have seen me. Instead, I stopped close to the opposite wall, beneath an overhanging mass of rock that cast a dense shadow beneath it. Here I could watch Thurid without danger of discovery. The black was standing upon the ledge beside his boat, looking up the river, as though he were awaiting one whom he expected from that direction. As I lay there beneath the dark rocks, I noticed that a strong current seemed to flow directly toward the center of the river, so that it was difficult to hold my craft in its position. I edged farther into the shadow that I might find a hold upon the bank, but though I proceeded several yards, I touched nothing, and then, finding that I would soon reach a point from where I could no longer see the black man, I was compelled to remain where I was, holding my position as best I could by paddling strongly against the current which flowed from beneath the rocky mass behind me. I could not imagine what might cause this strong lateral flow, for the main channel of the river was plainly visible to me from where I sat, and I could see the rippling junction of it and the mysterious current which had aroused my curiosity. While I was still speculating upon the phenomenon, my attention was suddenly riveted upon Thurid, who had raised both palms forward above his head in the universal salute of Martians, and a moment later his K-or, the Barsoomian word of greeting, came in low but distinct tones. I turned my eyes up the river in the direction that his were bent, and presently there came within my limited range of vision a long boat, in which were 6 men. 5 were at the paddles, while the 6th sat in the seat of honor. The white skins, the flowing yellow wigs which covered their bald pates, and the gorgeous diadems set in circlets of gold about their heads marked them as holy therns. As they drew up beside the ledge upon which Thurid awaited them, he in the bow of the boat arose to step ashore, and then I saw that it was none other than Mad-Eye Shang, father of Therns. The evident cordiality with which the two men exchanged greetings filled me with wonder, for the black and white men of Barsoom were hereditary enemies, nor ever before had I known of two meeting other than in battle. Evidently, the reverses that had recently overtaken both peoples had resulted in an alliance between these two individuals, at least against the common enemy. And now I saw why Thurid had come so often out into the valley door by night, and that the nature of his conspiring might be such as to strike very close to me or to my friends. I wished that I might have found a point closer to the two men from which to have heard their conversation, but it was out of the question now to attempt to cross the river, and so I lay quietly watching them, who would have given so much to have known how close I lay to them, and how easily they might have overcome and killed me with their superior force. Several times Thurid pointed across the river in my direction, but that his gestures had any reference to me I did not for a moment believe. Presently he and Mad-Eye Shang entered the latter's boat, which turned out into the river, and swinging round, forged steadily across in my direction. As they advanced, I moved my boat farther and farther in beneath the overhanging wall, but at last it became evident that their craft was holding the same course. 5 paddlers sent the larger boat ahead at a speed that taxed my energies to equal. Every instant I expected to feel my prow crash against solid rock. The light from the river was no longer visible, but ahead I saw the faint tinge of a distant radiance, and still the water before me was open. At last the truth dawned upon me. I was following a subterranean river which emptied into the Iss at the very point where I had hidden. The rowers were now quite close to me. The noise of their own paddles drowned the sound of mine, but in another instant the growing light ahead would reveal me to them. There was no time to be lost. Whatever action I was to take must be taken at once. Swinging the prow of my boat toward the right, I sought the river's rocky side, and there I lay while Mad-Eye Shang and Thurid approached up the center of the stream, which was much narrower than the Iss. As they came nearer, I heard the voices of Thurid and the father of Therns raised in argument. "I tell you, Thern," the Black Dejah was saying, "that I wish only vengeance upon John Carter, Prince of Helium. I am leading you into no trap. What could I gain by betraying you to those who have ruined my nation and my house? Let us stop here a moment that I may hear your plans," replied the Hecador, "and then we may proceed with a better understanding of our duties and obligations." To the rowers, he issued the command that brought their boat in toward the bank, not a dozen paces beyond the spot where I lay. Had they pulled in below me, they must surely have seen me against the faint glow of light ahead, but from where they finally came to rest, I was as secure from detection as though miles separated us. The few words I had already overheard whetted my curiosity, and I was anxious to learn what manner of vengeance Thurid was planning against me. Nor had I long to wait. I listened intently. "There are no obligations, father of Therns," continued the firstborn. "Thurid, Dejah of Issus, has no price. When the thing has been accomplished, I shall be glad if you will see to it that I am well received, as is befitting my ancient lineage and noble rank, at some court that is yet loyal to thy ancient faith, for I cannot return to the valley door or elsewhere within the power of the Prince of Helium. But even that I do not demand, it shall be as your own desire in the matter directs." "It shall be as you wish, Dejah," replied Mad-Eye Shang. "Nor is that all. Power and riches shall be yours if you restore my daughter, Fedor, to me, and place within my power Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium." "Ah," he continued with a malicious snarl, "but the earth-man shall suffer for the indignities he has put upon the Holy of Holies, nor shall any vileness be too vile to inflict upon his princess. Would that it were in my power to force him to witness the humiliation and degradation of the Red Woman." "You shall have your way with her before another day has passed, Mad-Eye Shang," said Thurid, "if you but say the word." "I have heard of the Temple of the Sun, Dejah," replied Mad-Eye Shang, "but never have I heard that its prisoners could be released before the allotted year of their incarceration had elapsed. How, then, may you accomplish the impossible?" "Access may be had to any cell of the temple at any time," replied Thurid. Only Issus knew this, nor was it ever Issus' way to divulge more of her secrets than were necessary. By chance, after her death, I came upon an ancient plan of the temple, and there I found, plainly writ, the most minute directions for reaching the cells at any time. And more I learned, that many men had gone thither for Issus in the past, always on errands of death and torture to the prisoners. But those who thus learned the secret way were wont to die mysteriously immediately. They had returned and made their reports to cruel Issus. "Let us proceed, then," said Madai Shang at last. "I must trust you, yet at the same time you must trust me, for we are 6 to your 1. "I do not fear," replied Thurid, "nor need you. Our hatred of the common enemy is sufficient bond to ensure our loyalty to each other, and after we have defiled the Princess of Helium, there will be still greater reason for the maintenance of our allegiance, unless I greatly mistake the temper of her lord." Madai Shang spoke to the paddlers. The boat moved on up the tributary. It was with difficulty that I restrained myself from rushing upon them and slaying the 2 vile plotters. But quickly I saw the mad rashness of such an act, which would cut down the only man who could lead the way to Dejah Thoris prison before the long Martian year had swung its interminable circle. If he should lead Madai Shang to that hallowed spot, then, too, should he lead John Carter, Prince of Helium. With silent paddle, I swung slowly into the wake of the larger craft. Chapter 2. Under the Mountains. As we advanced up the river, which winds beneath the golden cliffs out of the bowels of the Mountains of Arts, to mingle its dark waters with the grim and mysterious, the faint glow which had appeared before us grew gradually into an all-enveloping radiance. The river widened until it presented the aspect of a large lake whose vaulted dome, lighted by glowing phosphorescent rock, was splashed with the vivid rays of the diamond, the sapphire, the ruby, and the countless, nameless jewels of Barsoom which lay encrusted in the virgin gold which forms the major portion of these magnificent cliffs. Beyond the lighted chamber of the lake was darkness. What lay behind the darkness I could not even guess. To have followed the Thurn boat across the gleaming water would have been to invite instant detection. And so, though I was loath to permit Thurid to pass even for an instant beyond my sight, I was forced to wait in the shadows until the other boat had passed from my sight at the far extremity of the lake. Then I paddled out upon the brilliant surface in the direction they had taken. When, after what seemed an eternity, I reached the shadows at the upper end of the lake, I found that the river issued from a low aperture, to pass beneath which it was necessary that I compel Wooler to lie flat in the boat, and I, myself, must need bend double before the low roof cleared my head. Immediately the roof rose again upon the other side, but no longer was the way brilliantly lighted. Instead, only a feeble glow emanated from small and scattered patches of phosphorescent rock in wall and roof. Directly before me, the river ran into this smaller chamber through 3 separate arched openings. Thurid and the Therns were nowhere to be seen. Into which of the dark holes had they disappeared? There was no means by which I might know, and so I chose the center opening as being as likely to lead me in the right direction as another. Here the way was through utter darkness. The stream was narrow, so narrow that in the blackness I was constantly bumping first one rock wall and then another as the river wound hither and thither along its flinty bed. Far ahead I presently heard a deep and sullen roar which increased in volume as I advanced, and then broke upon my ears with all the intensity of its mad fury as I swung round a sharp curve into a dimly lighted stretch of water. Directly before me, the river thundered down from above in a mighty waterfall that filled the narrow gorge from side to side, rising far above me several hundred feet, as magnificent a spectacle as I ever had seen. But the roar, the awful, deafening roar of those tumbling waters penned in the rocky, subterranean vault, had the fall not entirely blocked my further passage and shown me that I had followed the wrong course, I believe that I should have fled anyway before the maddening tumult. Thurid and the Therns could not have come this way. By stumbling upon the wrong course, I had lost the trail, and they had gained so much ahead of me that now I might not be able to find them before it was too late, if, in fact, I could find them at all. It had taken several hours to force my way up to the falls against the strong current, and other hours would be required for the descent, although the pace would be much swifter. With a sigh, I turned the prow of my craft downstream, and with mighty strokes hastened, with reckless speed, through the dark and tortuous channel, until once again I came to the chamber into which flowed the 3 branches of the river. 2 unexplored channels still remained from which to choose, nor was there any means by which I could judge which was the more likely to lead me to the plotters. Never in my life, that I can recall, have I suffered such an agony of indecision. So much depended upon a correct choice, So much depended upon haste. The hours that I had already lost might seal the fate of the incomparable Dejah Thoris, were she not already dead, to sacrifice other hours, and maybe days, in a fruitless exploration of another blind lead, would unquestionably prove fatal. Several times I essayed the right-hand entrance only to turn back, as though warned by some strange intuitive sense that this was not the way. At last, convinced by the oft-recurring phenomenon, I cast my all upon the left-hand archway. Yet it was with a lingering doubt that I turned a parting look at the sullen waters which rolled, dark and forbidding, from beneath the grim, low archway on the right, and as I looked there came barbing out upon the current from the Stygian darkness of the interior the shell of one of the great, succulent fruits of the sorapus tree. I could scarce restrain a shout of elation as this silent, insensate messenger floated past me, on toward the Iss and chorus, for it told me that journeying Martians were above me on that very stream. They had eaten of this marvelous fruit, which nature concentrates within the hard shell of the sorapus nut, and having eaten had cast the husk overboard. It could have come from no others than the party I sought. Quickly, I abandoned all thought of the left-hand passage, and a moment later had turned into the right. The stream soon widened, and recurring areas of phosphorescent rock lighted my way. I made good time, but was convinced that I was nearly a day behind those I was tracking. Neither Wooler nor I had eaten since the previous day, but in so far as he was concerned, it mattered but little, since practically all the animals of the Dead Sea bottoms of Mars are able to go for incredible periods without nourishment. Nor did I suffer. The water of the river was sweet and cold, for it was unpolluted by decaying bodies, like the Iss. And as for food, why, the mere thought that I was nearing my beloved princess raised me above every material want. As I proceeded, the river became narrower and the current swift and turbulent, so swift, in fact, that it was with difficulty that I forced my craft upward at all. I could not have been making to exceed 100 yards an hour when, at a bend, I was confronted by a series of rapids through which the river foamed and boiled at a terrific rate. My heart sank within me. The sorapus nutshell had proved a false prophet, and after all, my intuition had been correct. It was the left-hand channel that I should have followed. Had I been a woman, I should have wept. At my right was a great, slow-moving eddy that circled far beneath the cliff's overhanging side, and to rest my tired muscles before turning back, I let my boat drift into its embrace. I was almost prostrated by disappointment. It would mean another half-day's loss of time to retrace my way and take the only passage that yet remained unexplored. What hellish fate had led me to select from 3 possible avenues the 2 that were wrong? As the lazy current of the eddy carried me slowly about the periphery of the watery circle, my boat twice touched the rocky side of the river in the dark recess beneath the cliff. A third time it struck, gently as it had before, but the contact resulted in a different sound, the sound of wood scraping upon wood. In an instant, I was on the alert, for there could be no wood within that buried river that had not been man-brought. Almost coincidentally with my first apprehension of the noise, my hand shot out across the boat's side, and a second later I felt my fingers gripping the gunwale of another craft. As though turned to stone, I sat in tense and rigid silence, straining my eyes into the utter darkness before me in an effort to discover if the boat were occupied. It was entirely possible that there might be men on board it who were still ignorant of my presence, for the boat was scraping gently against the rocks upon one side, so that the gentle touch of my boat upon the other easily could have gone unnoticed. Peer as I would, I could not penetrate the darkness, and then I listened intently for the sound of breathing near me. But except for the noise of the rapids, the soft scraping of the boats, and the lapping of the water at their sides, I could distinguish no sound. As usual, I thought rapidly. A rope lay coiled in the bottom of my own craft. Very softly I gathered it up, and making one end fast to the bronze ring in the prow, I stepped gingerly into the boat beside me. In one hand I grasped the rope, in the other my keen longsword. For a full minute, perhaps, I stood motionless after entering the strange craft. It had rocked a trifle beneath my weight, but it had been the scraping of its side against the side of my own boat that had seemed most likely to alarm its occupants, if there were any. There was no answering sound, and a moment later I had felt from stem to stern and found the boat deserted. Groping with my hands along the face of the rocks to which the craft was moored, I discovered a narrow ledge which I knew must be the avenue taken by those who had come before me. that they could be none other than Thurid, and his party I was convinced by the size and build of the boat I had found. Calling to Wooler to follow me, I stepped out upon the ledge. The great, savage brute, agile as a cat, crept after me. As he passed through the boat that had been occupied by Thurid and the Therns, he emitted a single low growl, and when he came beside me upon the ledge, and my hand rested upon his neck, I felt his short mane bristling with anger. I think he sensed telepathically the recent presence of an enemy, for I had made no effort to impart to him the nature of our quest or the status of those we tracked. This omission I now made haste to correct, and, after the manner of green Martians with their beasts, I let him know partially by the weird and uncanny telepathy of Barsoom, and partly by word of mouth, that we were upon the trail of those who had recently occupied the boat through which we had just passed. A soft purr, like that of a great cat, indicated that Wooler understood, and then, with a word to him to follow, I turned to the right along the ledge. But scarcely had I done so than I felt his mighty fangs tugging at my leathern harness. As I turned to discover the cause of his act, he continued to pull me steadily in the opposite direction, nor would he desist until I had turned about and indicated that I would follow him voluntarily. Never had I known him to be in error in a matter of tracking, so it was with a feeling of entire security that I moved cautiously in the huge beast's wake. Through Cimmerian darkness, he moved along the narrow ledge beside the boiling rapids. As we advanced, the way led from beneath the overhanging cliffs out into a dim light, and then it was that I saw that the trail had been cut from the living rock, and that it ran up along the river's side beyond the rapids. For hours, we followed the dark and gloomy river farther and farther into the bowels of Mars. From the direction and distance, I knew that we must be well beneath the valley door, and possibly beneath the Sea of Omean as well. It could not be much farther now to the Temple of the Sun. Even as my mind framed the thought, Wooler halted suddenly before a narrow, arched doorway in the cliff by the trail's side. Quickly, he crouched back away from the entrance, at the same time turning his eyes toward me. Words could not have more plainly told me that danger of some sort lay nearby, and so I pressed quietly forward to his side, and passing him looked into the aperture at our right. Before me was a fair-sized chamber that, from its appointments, I knew must have at one time been a guard-room. There were racks for weapons, and slightly raised platforms for the sleeping silks and furs of the warriors, but now its only occupants were two of the Therns who had been of the party with Thurid and Mad-Eye Shang. The men were in earnest conversation, and from their tones it was apparent that they were entirely unaware that they had listeners. "I tell you," one of them was saying, "I do not trust the Black One. There was no necessity for leaving us here to guard the way. Against what, pray, should we guard this long-forgotten, abysmal path? It was but a ruse to divide our numbers. He will have Mad-Eye Shang leave others elsewhere on some pretext or other, and then at last he will fall upon us with his confederates and slay us all." "I believe you, Lacquer," replied the other. "There can never be aught else than deadly hatred between Thern and Firstborn. And what think you of the ridiculous matter of the light? Let the light shine with the intensity of 3 radium units for 50 tals, and for 1 zat let it shine with the intensity of 1 radium unit, and then for 25 tals with 9 units. Those were his very words, and to think that wise old Mad-Eye Shang should listen to such foolishness." "Indeed, it is silly," replied Lacquer. "It will open nothing other than the way to a quick death for us all." He had to make some answer when Mad-Eye Shang asked him flatly what he should do when he came to the Temple of the Sun, and so he made his answer quickly from his imagination. I would wager a Hecador's diadem that he could not now repeat it himself. "Let us not remain here longer, Lacquer," spoke the other Thern. "Perchance, if we hasten after them, we may come in time to rescue Mad-Eye Shang and wreak our own vengeance upon the Black Dejah. What say you?" "Never in a long life," answered Lacquer, "have I disobeyed a single command of the father of Therns. I shall stay here until I rot if he does not return to bid me elsewhere." Lacquer's companion shook his head. "You are my superior," he said. "I cannot do other than you sanction, though I still believe that we are foolish to remain." I, too, thought that they were foolish to remain, for I saw from Wooler's actions that the trail led through the room where the 2 Therns held guard. I had no reason to harbor any considerable love for this race of self-deified demons, yet I would have passed them by were it possible without molesting them. It was worth trying anyway, for a fight might delay us considerably, or even put an end entirely to my search. Better men than I have gone down before fighters of meaner ability than that possessed by the fierce Thurn warriors. Signaling Wooler to heal, I stepped suddenly into the room before the two men. At sight of me, their long swords flashed from the harness at their sides, but I raised my hand in a gesture of restraint. "I seek Thurid, the Black Data," I said. "My quarrel is with him, not with you. Let me pass then in peace, for if I mistake not, he is as much your enemy as mine, and you can have no cause to protect him." They lowered their swords, and Lacquer spoke. "Know not whom you may be, with the white skin of a Thurn and the black hair of a red man. But were it only Thurid whose safety were at stake, you might pass, and welcome, in so far as we be concerned. Tell us who you be, and what mission calls you to this unknown world beneath the valley door. Then maybe we can see our way to let you pass upon the errand which we should like to undertake would our orders permit." I was surprised that neither of them had recognized me, for I thought that I was quite sufficiently well known, either by personal experience or reputation, to every Thurn upon Barsoom, as to make my identity immediately apparent in any part of the planet. In fact, I was the only white man upon Mars whose hair was black and whose eyes were gray, with the exception of my son, Dejah Thoris. To reveal my identity might be to precipitate an attack, for every Thurn upon Barsoom knew that, to me, they owed the fall of their age-old spiritual supremacy. On the other hand, my reputation as a fighting man might be sufficient to pass me by these two, with their livers not of the right complexion to welcome a battle to the death. To be quite candid, I did not attempt to delude myself with any such sophistry, since I knew well that upon warlike Mars there are few cowards, and that every man, whether prince, priest, or peasant, glories in deadly strife. And so I gripped my long sword the tighter as I replied to Lacquer. "I believe that you will see the wisdom of permitting me to pass unmolested," I said, "for it would avail you nothing to die uselessly in the rocky bowels of Barsoom merely to protect a hereditary enemy, such as Thurid, Dejah of the Firstborn. That you shall die, should you elect to oppose me, is evidenced by the mouldering corpses of all the many great Barsoomian warriors who have gone down beneath this blade. I am John Carter, Prince of Helium." For a moment that name seemed to paralyze the two men, but only for a moment, and then the younger of them, with a vile name upon his lips, rushed toward me with ready sword. He had been standing a little behind his companion Lacquer during our parley, and now, ere he could engage me, the older man grasped his harness and drew him back. "Hold," commanded Lacquer. "There will be plenty of time to fight, if we find it wise to fight at all. There be good reasons why every Thurn upon Barsoom should yearn to spill the blood of the blasphemer, the sacrilegist. But let us mix wisdom with our righteous hate. The Prince of Helium is bound upon an errand which we ourselves, but a moment since, were wishing that we might undertake. Let him go then, and slay the Black. When he returns, we shall still be here to bar his way to the outer world, and thus we shall have rid ourselves of two enemies, nor have incurred the displeasure of the father of Thurns." As he spoke, I could not but note the crafty glint in his evil eyes, and while I saw the apparent logic of his reasoning, I felt, subconsciously perhaps, that his words did but veil some sinister intent. The other Thurn turned toward him in evident surprise, but when Lacquer had whispered a few brief words into his ear, he, too, drew back and nodded acquiescence to his superior's suggestion. "Proceed, John Carter," said Lacquer, "but know that if Thurid does not lay you low, there will be those awaiting your return who will see that you never pass again into the sunlight of the upper world. Go." During our conversation, Wooler had been growling and bristling close to my side. Occasionally, he would look up into my face with a low, pleading whine, as though begging for the word that would send him headlong at the bare throats before him. He, too, sensed the villainy behind the smooth words. Beyond the Thurns, several doorways opened off the guardroom, and toward the one upon the extreme right Lacquer motioned. "That way leads to Thurid," he said. But when I would have called Wooler to follow me there, the beast whined and held back, and at last ran quickly to the first opening at the left, where he stood emitting his coughing bark, as though urging me to follow him upon the right way. I turned a questioning look upon Lacquer. "The brute is seldom wrong," I said. "I do not doubt your superior knowledge, Thurn. I think that I shall do well to listen to the voice of instinct that is backed by love and loyalty." As I spoke, I smiled grimly that he might know without words that I distrusted him. "As you will," the fellow replied with a shrug. "In the end it shall be all the same." I turned and followed Wooler into the left-hand passage, and though my back was toward my enemies, my ears were on the alert. Yet I heard no sound of pursuit. The passageway was dimly lighted by occasional radium bulbs, the universal lighting medium of Barsoom. These same lamps may have been doing continuous duty in these subterranean chambers for ages, since they require no attention and are so compounded that they give off but the minutest of their substance in the generation of years of luminosity. We had proceeded for but a short distance when we commenced to pass the mouths of diverging corridors, but not once did Wooler hesitate. It was at the opening to one of these corridors upon my right that I presently heard a sound that spoke more plainly to John Carter, fighting man, than could the words of my mother tongue. It was the clank of metal, the metal of a warrior's harness, and it came from a little distance up the corridor upon my right. Wooler heard it, too, and like a flash he had wheeled and stood facing the threatened danger, his mane all a-bristle, and all his rows of glistening fangs bared by snarling, back-drawn lips. With a gesture I silenced him, and together we drew aside into another corridor a few paces farther on. Here we waited, nor did we have long to wait, for presently we saw the shadows of two men fall upon the floor of the main corridor athwart the doorway of our hiding place. Very cautiously they were moving now. The accidental clank that had alarmed me was not repeated. Presently they came opposite our station, nor was I surprised to see that the two were Lacquer and his companion of the guardroom. They walked very softly, and in the right hand of each gleamed a keen longsword. They halted quite close to the entrance of our retreat, whispering to each other. "Can it be that we have distanced them already?" said Lacquer. "Either that, or the beast has led the man upon a wrong trail," replied the other. "For the way which we took is by far the shorter to this point, for him who knows it. John Carter would have found it a short road to death had he taken it, as you suggested to him." "Yes," said Lacquer, "no amount of fighting ability would have saved him from the pivoted flagstone. He surely would have stepped upon it, and by now, if the pit beneath it has a bottom which Thurid denies, he should have been rapidly approaching it. Curses on that callot of his that warned him toward the safer avenue. There be other dangers ahead of him, though," spoke Lacquer's fellow, "which he may not so easily escape, should he succeed in escaping our two good swords. Consider, for example, what chance he will have, coming unexpectedly into the chamber of—" I would have given much to have heard the balance of that conversation, that I might have been warned of the perils that lay ahead. But fate intervened, and just at the very instant of all other instants that I would not have elected to do it, I sneezed. Chapter 3. The Temple of the Sun. There was nothing for it now other than to fight, nor did I have any advantage as I sprang, sword in hand, into the corridor before the two Therns, for my untimely sneeze had warned them of my presence, and they were ready for me. There were no words, for they would have been a waste of breath. The very presence of the two proclaimed their treachery. That they were following to fall upon me unawares was all too plain, and they, of course, must have known that I understood their plan. In an instant I was engaged with both, and though I loathe the very name of Thern, I must in all fairness admit that they are mighty swordsmen. And these two were no exception, unless it were that they were even more skilled and fearless than the average among their race. While it lasted, it was indeed as joyous a conflict as I ever had experienced. Twice, at least, I saved my breast from the mortal thrust of piercing steel only by the wondrous agility with which my earthly muscles endow me under the conditions of lesser gravity and air pressure upon Mars. Yet even so I came near to tasting death that day in the gloomy corridor beneath Mars's southern pole. For Lacquer played a trick upon me that in all my experience of fighting upon two planets I never before had witnessed the like of. The other Thern was engaging me at the time, and I was forcing him back, touching him here and there with my point until he was bleeding from a dozen wounds, yet not being able to penetrate his marvelous guard to reach a vulnerable spot for the brief instant that would have been sufficient to send him to his ancestors. It was then that Lacquer quickly unslung a belt from his harness, and as I stepped back to parry a wicked thrust, he lashed one end of it about my left ankle so that it wounded there for an instant, while he jerked suddenly upon the other end, throwing me heavily upon my back. Then, like leaping panthers, they were upon me, but they had reckoned without Wooler, and before ever a blade touched me, a roaring embodiment of 1,000 demons hurtled above my prostrate form, and my loyal Martian callot was upon them. Imagine, if you can, a huge grizzly with 10 legs armed with mighty talons, and an enormous frog-like mouth splitting his head from ear to ear, exposing 3 rows of long, white tusks. Then endow this creature of your imagination with the agility and ferocity of a half-starved Bengal tiger and the strength of a span of bulls, and you will have some faint conception of Wooler in action. Before I could call him off, he had crushed lacquer into a jelly with a single blow of one mighty paw, and had literally torn the other thurn to ribbons. Yet when I spoke to him sharply, he cowed sheepishly, as though he had done a thing to deserve censure and chastisement. Never had I had the heart to punish Wooler during the long years that had passed since that first day upon Mars, when the green Jed of the Tharks had placed him on guard over me, and I had won his love and loyalty from the cruel and loveless masters of his former life. Yet I believe he would have submitted to any cruelty that I might have inflicted upon him, so wondrous was his affection for me. The diadem in the center of the circlet of gold upon the brow of lacquer proclaimed him a holy thurn, while his companion, not thus adorned, was a lesser thurn, though from his harness I gleaned that he had reached the 9th cycle, which is but one below that of the holy thurns. As I stood for a moment looking at the gruesome havoc Wooler had wrought, there recurred to me the memory of that other occasion upon which I had masqueraded in the wig, diadem, and harness of Satyr Throg, the holy thurn whom Thuvia of Tarth had slain, and now it occurred to me that it might prove of worth to utilize lacquer's trappings for the same purpose. A moment later I had torn his yellow wig from his bald pate and transferred it, and the circlet, as well as all his harness, to my own person. Wooler did not approve of the metamorphosis. He sniffed at me and growled ominously, but when I spoke to him and patted his huge head, he at length became reconciled to the change, and at my command trotted off along the corridor in the direction we had been going when our progress had been interrupted by the Therns. We moved cautiously now, warned by the fragment of conversation I had overheard. I kept abreast of Wooler that we might have the benefit of all our eyes for what might appear suddenly ahead to menace us, and well it was that we were forewarned. At the bottom of a flight of narrow steps, the corridor turned sharply back upon itself, immediately making another turn in the original direction, so that at that point it formed a perfect letter S, the top leg of which debouched suddenly into a large chamber, illy lighted, and the floor of which was completely covered by venomous snakes and loathsome reptiles. To have attempted to cross that floor would have been to court instant death, and for a moment I was almost completely discouraged. Then it occurred to me that Thurid and Mad-Eye Shang with their party must have crossed it, and so there was a way. Had it not been for the fortunate accident by which I overheard even so small a portion of the Thern's conversation, we should have blundered at least a step or two into that wriggling mass of destruction, and a single step would have been all sufficient to have sealed our doom. These were the only reptiles I had ever seen upon Barsoom, but I knew from their similarity to the fossilized remains of supposedly extinct species I had seen in the museums of Helium that they comprised many of the known prehistoric reptilian genera, as well as others undiscovered. A more hideous aggregation of monsters had never before assailed my vision. It would be futile to attempt to describe them to Earthmen, since substance is the only thing which they possess in common with any creature of the past or present with which you are familiar. Even their venom is of an unearthly virulence that, by comparison, would make the cobra de Capello seem quite as harmless as an angleworm. As they spied me, there was a concerted rush by those nearest the entrance where we stood, but a line of radium bulbs inset along the threshold of their chamber brought them to a sudden halt. Evidently, they dared not cross that line of light. I had been quite sure that they would not venture beyond the room in which I had discovered them, though I had not guessed at what deterred them. The simple fact that we had found no reptiles in the corridor through which we had just come was sufficient assurance that they did not venture there. I drew Wooler out of harm's way, and then began a careful survey of as much of the chamber of reptiles as I could see from where I stood. As my eyes became accustomed to the dim light of its interior, I gradually made out a low gallery at the far end of the apartment from which opened several exits. Coming as close to the threshold as I dared, I followed this gallery with my eyes, discovering that it circled the room as far as I could see. Then I glanced above me along the upper edge of the entrance to which we had come, and there, to my delight, I saw an end of the gallery not a foot above my head. In an instant I had leaped to it and called Wooler after me. Here there were no reptiles, The way was clear to the opposite side of the hideous chamber, and a moment later Wooler and I dropped down to safety in the corridor beyond. Not 10 minutes later, we came into a vast circular apartment of white marble, the walls of which were inlaid with gold in the strange hieroglyphics of the firstborn. From the high dome of this mighty apartment, a huge circular column extended to the floor, and as I watched, I saw that it slowly revolved. I had reached the base of the Temple of the Sun. Somewhere above me lay Dejah Thoris, and with her were Fedor, daughter of Madai Shang, and Thuvia of Tarth. But how to reach them, now that I had found the only vulnerable spot in their mighty prison, was still a baffling riddle. Slowly I circled the great shaft, looking for a means of ingress. Part way around I found a tiny radium flash torch, and as I examined it in mild curiosity as to its presence there in this almost inaccessible and unknown spot, I came suddenly upon the insignia of the House of Thurid Julinset in its metal case. I am upon the right trail, I thought, as I slipped the bauble into the pocket pouch which hung from my harness. Then I continued my search for the entrance, which I knew must be somewhere about. Nor had I long to search, for almost immediately thereafter I came upon a small door so cunningly inlaid in the shaft's base that it might have passed unnoticed by a less keen or careful observer. There was the door that would lead me within the prison, but where was the means to open it? No button or lock were visible. Again and again, I went carefully over every square inch of its surface, but the most that I could find was a tiny pinhole a little above and to the right of the door's center, a pinhole that seemed only an accident of manufacture or an imperfection of material. Into this minute aperture I attempted to peer, but whether it was but a fraction of an inch deep or passed completely through the door, I could not tell. At least no light showed beyond it. I put my ear to it next and listened, but again my efforts brought negligible results. During these experiments, Wooler had been standing at my side, gazing intently at the door, and as my glance fell upon him, it occurred to me to test the correctness of my hypothesis, that this portal had been the means of ingress to the temple used by Thurid, the Black Data, and Madai Shang, father of Therns. Turning away abruptly, I called to him to follow me. For a moment he hesitated, and then leaped after me, whining and tugging at my harness to draw me back. I walked on, however, some distance from the door before I let him have his way, that I might see precisely what he would do. Then I permitted him to lead me wherever he would. Straight back to that baffling portal, he dragged me, again taking up his position facing the blank stone, gazing straight at its shining surface. For an hour I worked to solve the mystery of the combination that would open the way before me. Carefully I recalled every circumstance of my pursuit of Thurid, and my conclusion was identical with my original belief, that Thurid had come this way without other assistance than his own knowledge, and passed through the door that barred my progress, unaided from within. But how had he accomplished it? I recalled the incident of the Chamber of Mystery in the Golden Cliffs. That time I had freed Thuvia of Tarth from the dungeon of the Therns, and she had taken a slender, needle-like key from the keyring of her dead jailer to open the door leading back into the Chamber of Mystery, where Tarkas fought for his life with the great Banths. Such a tiny keyhole as now defied me had opened the way to the intricate lock in that other door. Hastily, I dumped the contents of my pocket pouch upon the ground before me. Could I but find a slender bit of steel, I might yet fashion a key that would give me ingress to the temple prison. As I examined the heterogeneous collection of odds and ends that is always to be found in the pocket pouch of a Martian warrior, my hand fell upon the emblazoned radium flash torch of the Black Data. As I was about to lay the thing aside as of no value in my present predicament, my eyes chanced upon a few strange characters roughly and freshly scratched upon the soft gold of the case. Casual curiosity prompted me to decipher them, but what I read carried no immediate meaning to my mind. There were 3 sets of characters, one below another. For only an instant my curiosity was piqued, and then I replaced the torch in my pocket pouch. But my fingers had not unclasped from it when there rushed to my memory the recollection of the conversation between Lacquer and his companion, when the Lesser Thern had quoted the words of Thurid and scoffed at them. And what think you of the ridiculous matter of the light? Let the light shine with the intensity of 3 radium units for 50 tals. Ah, there was the first line of characters upon the torch's metal case, 350T, and for 1 zat let it shine with the intensity of 1 radium unit. There was the second line. and then for 25 tals with 9 units. The formula was complete. But what did it mean? I thought I knew, and seizing a powerful magnifying glass from the litter of my pocket pouch, I applied myself to a careful examination of the marble, immediately about the pinhole in the door. I could have cried aloud in exultation when my scrutiny disclosed the almost invisible incrustation of particles of carbonized electrons which are thrown off by these Martian torches. It was evident that for countless ages radium torches had been applied to this pinhole, and for what purpose there could be but a single answer. The mechanism of the lock was actuated by light rays, and I, John Carter, Prince of Helium, held the combination in my hand, scratched by the hand of my enemy upon his own torch case. In a cylindrical bracelet of gold about my wrist was my Barsoomian chronometer, a delicate instrument that records the tals and zats and zodes of Martian time, presenting them to view beneath a strong crystal much after the manner of an earthly odometer. Timing my operations carefully, I held the torch to the small aperture in the door, regulating the intensity of the light by means of the thumb lever upon the side of the case. For 50 tals, I let 3 units of light shine full in the pinhole, then 1 unit for 1 zat, and for 25 tals, 9 units. Those last 25 tals were the longest 25 seconds of my life, with the lock click at the end of those seemingly interminable intervals of time. 23, 24, 25. I shut off the light with a snap. For 7 tals I waited. There had been no appreciable effect upon the lock's mechanism. Could it be that my theory was entirely wrong? Hold! Had the nervous strain resulted in a hallucination, or did the door really move? Slowly, the solid stone sank noiselessly back into the wall. There was no hallucination here. Back and back, it slid for 10 feet until it had disclosed at its right a narrow doorway leading into a dark and narrow corridor that paralleled the outer wall. Scarcely was the entrance uncovered than Wooler and I had leaped through. Then the door slipped quietly back into place. Down the corridor at some distance, I saw the faint reflection of a light, and toward this we made our way. At the point where the light shone was a sharp turn, and a little distance beyond this, a brilliantly lighted chamber. Here we discovered a spiral stairway leading up from the center of the circular room. Immediately, I knew that we had reached the center of the base of the Temple of the Sun. The spiral runway led upward, past the inner walls of the prison cells. Somewhere above me was Dejah Thoris, unless Thurid and Mad-Eye Shang had already succeeded in stealing her. We had scarcely started up the runway when Wooler suddenly displayed the wildest excitement. He leaped back and forth, snapping at my legs and harness, until I thought that he was mad, and finally, when I pushed him from me and started once more to ascend, he grasped my sword arm between his jaws and dragged me back. No amount of scolding or cuffing would suffice to make him release me, and I was entirely at the mercy of his brute strength, unless I cared to use my dagger upon him with my left hand. But mad or no, I had not the heart to run the sharp blade into that faithful body. Down into the chamber he dragged me, and across it to the side opposite that at which we had entered. Here was another doorway leading into a corridor which ran directly down a steep incline. Without a moment's hesitation, Wooler jerked me along this rocky passage. Presently he stopped and released me, standing between me and the way we had come, looking up into my face as though to ask if I would now follow him voluntarily or if he must still resort to force. Looking ruefully at the marks of his great teeth upon my bare arm, I decided to do as he seemed to wish me to do. After all, his strange instinct might be more dependable than my faulty human judgment. And well it was that I had been forced to follow him. But a short distance from the circular chamber, we came suddenly into a brilliantly lighted labyrinth of crystal glass partitioned passages. At first, I thought it was one vast, unbroken chamber. So clear and transparent were the walls of the winding corridors. But after I had nearly brained myself a couple of times by attempting to pass through solid vitreous walls, I went more carefully. We had proceeded but a few yards along the corridor that had given us entrance to this strange maze, when Wooler gave mouth to a most frightful roar, at the same time dashing against the clear partition at our left. The resounding echoes of that fearsome cry were still reverberating through the subterranean chambers when I saw the thing that had startled it from the faithful beast. Far in the distance, dimly through the many thicknesses of intervening crystal, as in a haze that made them seem unreal and ghostly, I discerned the figures of 8 people, 3 females and 5 men. At the same instant, evidently startled by Wooler's fierce cry, they halted and looked about. Then, of a sudden, one of them, a woman, held her arms out toward me, and even at that great distance I could see that her lips moved. It was Dejah Thoris, my ever-beautiful and ever-youthful princess of Helium. With her were Thuvia of Tarth, Phaedor, daughter of Mad-Eye Shang, and Thurid, and the father of Therns, and the 3 lesser Therns that had accompanied them. Thurid shook his fist at me, and then 2 of the Therns grasped Dejah Thoris and Thuvia roughly by their arms and hurried them on. A moment later, they had disappeared into a stone corridor beyond the labyrinth of glass. They say that love is blind, but so great a love as that of Dejah Thoris, that knew me even beneath the Thern disguise I wore, and across the misty vista of that crystal maze, must indeed be far from blind. Chapter 4. The Secret Tower. I have no stomach to narrate the monotonous events of the tedious days that Wooler and I spent ferreting our way across the labyrinth of glass, through the dark and devious ways beyond that, led beneath the valley door and golden cliffs, to emerge at last upon the flank of the Arts Mountains, just above the Valley of Lost Souls. That pitiful purgatory, peopled by the poor unfortunates who dare not continue their abandoned pilgrimage to Dor, or return to the various lands of the outer world from whence they came. Here the trail of Dejah Thoris abductors led along the mountain's base, across steep and rugged ravines, by the side of appalling precipices, and sometimes out into the valley, where we found fighting aplenty with the members of the various tribes that make up the population of this vale of hopelessness. But through it all we came at last to where the way led up a narrow gorge that grew steeper and more impracticable at every step, until before us loomed a mighty fortress buried beneath the side of an overhanging cliff. Here was the secret hiding place of Mad-Eye Shang, father of Therns. Here, surrounded by a handful of the faithful, the Hecador of the ancient faith, who had once been served by millions of vassals and dependents, dispensed the spiritual words among the half-dozen nations of Barsoom that still clung tenaciously to their false and discredited religion. Darkness was just falling as we came in sight of the seemingly impregnable walls of this mountain stronghold, and lest we be seen, I drew back with Wooler behind a jutting granite promontory, into a clump of the hardy purple scrub that thrives upon the barren sides of Arts. Here we lay until the quick transition from daylight to darkness had passed. Then I crept out to approach the fortress walls in search of a way within, either through carelessness or overconfidence in the supposed inaccessibility of their hiding place. The triple-barred gate stood ajar. Beyond were a handful of guards, laughing and talking over one of their incomprehensible Barsoomian games. I saw that none of the guardsmen had been of the party that accompanied Thurid and Mad-Eye Shang, and so, relying entirely upon my disguise, I walked boldly through the gateway and up to the Thern guard. The men stopped their game and looked up at me, but there was no sign of suspicion. Similarly, they looked at Wooler, growling at my heel. "Kaor," I said in true Martian greeting, and the warriors arose and saluted me. "I have but just found my way hither from the Golden Cliffs," I continued, "and seek audience with the Hecador Mad-Eye Shang, father of Therns. Where may he be found?" "Follow me," said one of the guard, and turning, led me across the outer courtyard toward a second buttressed wall. Why the apparent ease with which I seemingly deceived them did not rouse my suspicions, I know not, unless it was that my mind was still so full of that fleeting glimpse of my beloved princess that there was room in it for naught else. Be that as it may, the fact is that I marched buoyantly behind my guide, straight into the jaws of death. Afterward, I learned that Thern's spies had been aware of my coming for hours before I reached the hidden fortress. The gate had been purposely left ajar to tempt me on. The guards had been schooled well in their part of the conspiracy, and I, more like a schoolboy than a seasoned warrior, ran headlong into the trap. At the far side of the outer court, a narrow door let into the angle made by one of the buttresses with the wall. Here my guide produced a key and opened the way within. Then, stepping back, he motioned me to enter. "Mad-Eye Shang is in the temple court beyond," he said, and as Wooler and I passed through, the fellow closed the door quickly upon us. The nasty laugh that came to my ears through the heavy planking of the door after the lock clicked was my first intimation that all was not as it should be. I found myself in a small, circular chamber within the buttress. Before me, a door opened, presumably, upon the inner court beyond. For a moment I hesitated, all my suspicions now suddenly, though tardily, aroused. Then, with a shrug of my shoulders, I opened the door and stepped out into the glare of torches that lighted the inner court. Directly opposite me, a massive tower rose to a height of 300 feet. It was of the strangely beautiful modern Barsoomian style of architecture, its entire surface hand carved in bold relief with intricate and fanciful designs. 30 feet above the courtyard, and overlooking it, was a broad balcony, and there indeed was Mad-Eye Shang, and with him were Thurid and Fedor, Thuvia, and Dejah Thoris, the last two heavily ironed. A handful of Thurn warriors stood just behind the little party. As I entered the enclosure, the eyes of those in the balcony were full upon me. An ugly smile distorted the cruel lips of Mad-Eye Shang. Thurid hurled a taunt at me and placed a familiar hand upon the shoulder of my princess. Like a tigress, she turned upon him, striking the beast a heavy blow with the manacles upon her wrist. He would have struck back had not Mad-Eye Shang interfered, and then I saw that the two men were not over-friendly, for the manner of the Thurn was arrogant and domineering, as he made it plain to the firstborn that the Princess of Helium was the personal property of the father of Thurns, and Thurid's bearing toward the ancient Hecador savored not at all of liking or respect. When the altercation in the balcony had subsided, Mad-Eye Shang turned again to me. "Earthman," he cried, "you have earned a more ignoble death than now lies within our weakened power to inflict upon you. But that the death you die tonight may be doubly bitter, know you that, when you have passed, your widow becomes the wife of Mad-Eye Shang, Hecador of the Holy Thurns, for a Martian year. At the end of that time, as you know, she shall be discarded, as is the law among us, but not, as is usual, to lead a quiet and honored life as high priestess of some hallowed shrine. Instead, Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, shall become the plaything of my lieutenants, perhaps of thy most hated enemy, Thurid, the Black Data." As he ceased speaking, he awaited in silence, evidently for some outbreak of rage upon my part, something that would have added to the spice of his revenge. But I did not give him the satisfaction that he craved. Instead, I did the one thing of all others that might rouse his anger and increase his hatred of me. For I knew that if I died, Dejah Thoris, too, would find a way to die before they could heap further tortures or indignities upon her. Of all the Holy of Holies which the Thurn venerates and worships, none is more revered than the yellow wig which covers his bald pate, and next thereto comes the circlet of gold and the great diadem, whose scintillant rays mark the attainment of the 10th cycle. And knowing this, I removed the wig and circlet from my head, tossing them carelessly upon the flagging of the court. Then I wiped my feet upon the yellow tresses, and as a groan of rage arose from the balcony, I spat full upon the holy diadem. Mad-Eye Shang went livid with anger, but upon the lips of Thurid I could see a grim smile of amusement, for to him these things were not holy. So, lest he should derive too much amusement from my act, I cried. And thus did I with the holies of Issus, goddess of life eternal, ere I threw Issus herself to the mob that once had worshipped her, to be torn to pieces in her own temple. That put an end to Thurid's grinning, for he had been high in the favor of Issus. "Let us have an end to this blaspheming," he cried, turning to the father of Thurns. Mad-Eye Shang rose, and leaning over the edge of the balcony, gave voice to the weird call that I had heard from the lips of the priests upon the tiny balcony upon the face of the golden cliffs overlooking the valley door, when in times past they called the fearsome white apes and the hideous plant men to the feast of victims, floating down the broad bosom of the mysterious Iss toward the Cillian-infested waters of the lost sea of Chorus. "Let loose the death," he cried, and immediately a dozen doors in the base of the tower swung open, and a dozen grim and terrible banths sprang into the arena. This was not the first time that I had faced the ferocious Barsoomian lion, but never had I been pitted, single-handed, against a full dozen of them. Even with the assistance of the fierce Wooler, there could be but a single outcome to so unequal a struggle. For a moment the beasts hesitated beneath the brilliant glare of the torches, but presently their eyes, becoming accustomed to the light, fell upon Wooler and me, and with bristling manes and deep-throated roars they advanced, lashing their tawny sides with their powerful tails. In the brief interval of life that was left me, I shot a last, parting glance toward my Dejah Thoris. Her beautiful face was set in an expression of horror, and as my eyes met hers, she extended both arms toward me as, struggling with the guards who now held her, she endeavored to cast herself from the balcony into the pit beneath, that she might share my death with me. Then, as the bants were about to close upon me, she turned and buried her dear face in her arms. Suddenly, my attention was drawn toward Dejah of Tarth. The beautiful girl was leaning far over the edge of the balcony, her eyes bright with excitement. In another instant, the bants would be upon me, but I could not force my gaze from the features of the red girl, for I knew that her expression meant anything but the enjoyment of the grim tragedy that would so soon be enacted below her. There was some deeper, hidden meaning which I sought to solve. For an instant, I thought of relying on my earthly muscles and agility to escape the bants and reach the balcony, which I could easily have done. But I could not bring myself to desert the faithful Wooler and leave him to die alone beneath the cruel fangs of the hungry bants. That is not the way upon Barsoom, nor was it ever the way of John Carter. Then the secret of Dejah's excitement became apparent as from her lips there issued the purring sound I had heard once before. That time that, within the golden cliffs, she called the fierce bants about her and led them as a shepherdess might lead her flock of meek and harmless sheep. At the first note of that soothing sound the bants halted in their tracks, and every fierce head went high as the beasts sought the origin of the familiar call. Presently they discovered the red girl in the balcony above them, and turning, roared out their recognition and their greeting. Guards sprang to drag Dejah away, but ere they had succeeded, she had hurled a volley of commands at the listening brutes, and as one they turned and marched back into their dens. "You need not fear them now, John Carter," cried Dejah, before they could silence her. "Those bants will never harm you now, nor Wooler either." It was all I cared to know. There was naught to keep me from that balcony now, and with a long, running leap I sprang far aloft until my hands grasped its lowest sill. In an instant all was wild confusion. Mad-Eye Shang shrank back. Thurid sprang forward with drawn sword to cut me down. Again, Dejah Thoris wielded her heavy irons and fought him back. Then Mad-Eye Shang grasped her about the waist and dragged her away through a door leading within the tower. For an instant Thurid hesitated, and then, as though fearing that the father of Therns would escape him with the princess of Helium, he, too, dashed from the balcony in their wake. Fedor alone retained her presence of mind. Two of the guards she ordered to bear away Dejah of Tarth. The others she commanded to remain and prevent me from following. Then she turned toward me. "John Carter," she cried, "for the last time I offer you the love of Fedor, daughter of the holy Hecador. Accept, and your princess shall be returned to the court of her grandfather, and you shall live in peace and happiness. Refuse, and the fate that my father has threatened shall fall upon Dejah Thoris. You cannot save her now, for by this time they have reached a place where even you may not follow. Refuse, and naught can save you, for though the way to the last stronghold of the holy Therns was made easy for you, the way hence hath been made impassable. What say you?" "You knew my answer, Fedor," I replied, "before ever you spoke." "Make way," I cried to the guards, for John Carter, Prince of Helium, would pass. With that, I leaped over the low baluster that surrounded the balcony, and with drawn, longsword faced my enemies. There were 3 of them, but Fedor must have guessed what the outcome of the battle would be, for she turned and fled from the balcony the moment she saw that I would have none of her proposition. The 3 guardsmen did not wait for my attack. Instead, they rushed me, the 3 of them simultaneously, and it was that which gave me an advantage, for they fouled one another in the narrow precincts of the balcony, so that the foremost of them stumbled full upon my blade at the first onslaught. The red stain upon my point roused to its full the old bloodlust of the fighting man that has ever been so strong within my breast, so that my blade flew through the air with a swiftness and deadly accuracy that threw the 2 remaining Therns into wild despair. When at last the sharp steel found the heart of one of them, the other turned to flee, and guessing that his steps would lead him along the way taken by those I sought, I let him keep ever far enough ahead to think that he was safely escaping my sword. Through several inner chambers he raced, until he came to a spiral runway. Up this he dashed, I in close pursuit. At the upper end we came out into a small chamber, the walls of which were blank, except for a single window overlooking the slopes of Arts and the valley of lost souls beyond. Here the fellow tore frantically at what appeared to be but a piece of the blank wall opposite the single window. In an instant, I guessed that it was a secret exit from the room, and so I paused that he might have an opportunity to negotiate it, for I cared nothing to take the life of this poor servitor. All I craved was a clear road in pursuit of Dejah Thoris, my long-lost princess. But try as he would, the panel would yield neither to cunning nor force, so that eventually he gave it up and turned to face me. "Go thy way, Thurn," I said to him, pointing toward the entrance to the runway up which we had but just come. "I have no quarrel with you, nor do I crave your life. Go!" For answer he sprang upon me with his sword, and so suddenly at that I was like to have gone down before his first rush. So there was nothing for it but to give him what he sought, and that as quickly as might be, that I might not be delayed too long in this chamber, while Mad-Eye, Shang, and Thurid made way with Dejah Thoris and Thuvir of Tarth. The fellow was a clever swordsman, resourceful and extremely tricky. In fact, he seemed never to have heard that there existed such a thing as a code of honor, for he repeatedly outraged a dozen Barsoomian fighting customs that an honorable man would rather die than ignore. He even went so far as to snatch his holy wig from his head and throw it in my face, so as to blind me for a moment while he thrust at my unprotected breast. When he thrust, however, I was not there, for I had fought with Thurns before, and while none had ever resorted to precisely that same expedient, I knew them to be the least honorable and most treacherous fighters upon Mars, and so was ever on the alert for some new and devilish subterfuge when I was engaged with one of their race. But at length he overdid the thing, for drawing his short sword, he hurled it, javelin-wise, at my body, at the same instant rushing upon me with his long sword. A single sweeping circle of my own blade caught the flying weapon and hurled it clattering against the far wall, and then, as I sidestepped my antagonist's impetuous rush, I let him have my point full in the stomach as he hurtled by. Clear to the hilt, my weapon passed through his body, and with a frightful shriek he sank to the floor, dead, halting only for the brief instant that was required to wrench my sword from the carcass of my late antagonist. I sprang across the chamber to the blank wall beyond, through which the Thurn had attempted to pass. Here I sought for the secret of its lark, but all to no avail. In despair I tried to force the thing, but the cold, unyielding stone might well have laughed at my futile, puny endeavors. In fact, I could have sworn that I caught the faint suggestion of taunting laughter from beyond the baffling panel. In disgust, I desisted from my useless efforts and stepped to the chamber's single window. The slopes of Arts and the distant valley of Lost Souls held nothing to compel my interest then, but towering far above me, the tower's carved wall riveted my keenest attention. Somewhere within that massive pile was Dejah Thoris. Above me I could see windows. There possibly lay the only way by which I could reach her. The risk was great, but not too great when the fate of a world's most wondrous woman was at stake. I glanced below. 100 feet beneath lay jagged granite boulders at the brink of a frightful chasm upon which the tower abutted, and if not upon the boulders, then at the chasm's bottom lay death, should a foot slip but once, or clutching fingers loose their hold for the fraction of an instant. But there was no other way, and with a shrug, which I must admit was half-shudder, I stepped to the window's outer sill and began my perilous ascent. To my dismay I found that, unlike the ornamentation upon most heliometric structures, the edges of the carvings were quite generally rounded, so that at best my every hold was most precarious. 50 feet above me commenced a series of projecting cylindrical stones some 6 inches in diameter. These apparently circled the tower at 6-foot intervals, in bands 6 feet apart, and as each stone cylinder protruded some 4 or 5 inches beyond the surface of the other ornamentation, they presented a comparatively easy mode of ascent, could I but reach them. Laboriously, I climbed toward them by way of some windows which lay below them, for I hoped that I might find ingress to the tower through one of these, thence an easier avenue along which to prosecute my search. At times, so slight was my hold upon the rounded surfaces of the carving's edges that a sneeze, a cough, or even a slight gust of wind would have dislodged me and sent me hurtling to the depths below. But finally, I reached a point where my fingers could just clutch the sill of the lowest window, and I was on the point of breathing a sigh of relief when the sound of voices came to me from above through the open window. He can never solve the secret of that lark. The voice was Mad-Eye Shang's. Let us proceed to the hangar above that we may be far to the south before he finds another way, should that be possible. All things seem possible to that vile Calot, replied another voice, which I recognized as Thurid's. "Then let us haste," said Mad-Eye Shang. "But to be doubly sure, I will leave two who shall patrol this runway. Later they may follow us upon another flyer, overtaking us at Kaal." My upstretched fingers never reached the window sill. At the first sound of the voices, I drew back my hand and clung there to my perilous perch, flattened against the perpendicular wall, scarce daring to breathe. What a horrible position, indeed, in which to be discovered by Thurid. He had but to lean from the window to push me with his sword's point into eternity. Presently the sound of the voices became fainter, and once again I took up my hazardous ascent, now more difficult, since more circuitous, for I must climb so as to avoid the windows. Mad-Eye Shang's reference to the hangar, and the flyers indicated that my destination lay nothing short of the roof of the tower, and toward this seemingly distant goal I set my face. The most difficult and dangerous part of the journey was accomplished at last, and it was with relief that I felt my fingers close about the lowest of the stone cylinders. It is true that these projections were too far apart to make the balance of the ascent anything of a sinecure, but I at least had always within my reach a point of safety to which I might cling in case of accident. Some 10 feet below the roof, the wall inclined slightly inward, possibly a foot in the last 10 feet, and here the climbing was indeed immeasurably easier, so that my fingers soon clutched the eaves. As I drew my eyes above the level of the tower's top, I saw a flyer all but ready to rise. Upon her deck were Mad-Eye Shang, Fedor, Dejah Thoris, Thuvir of Tarth, and a few Thurn warriors, while near her was Thurid in the act of clambering aboard. He was not 10 paces from me, facing in the opposite direction, and what cruel freak of fate should have caused him to turn about just as my eyes topped the roof's edge I may not even guess. But turn he did, and when his eyes met mine, his wicked face lighted with a malignant smile as he leaped toward me, where I was hastening to scramble to the secure footing of the roof. Dejah Thoris must have seen me at the same instant, for she screamed a useless warning just as Thurid's foot, swinging in a mighty kick, landed full in my face. Like a felled ox, I reeled and tumbled backward over the tower's side. Chapter 5. On the Kaalian Road. If there be a fate that is sometimes cruel to me, there surely is a kind and merciful providence which watches over me. As I toppled from the tower into the horrid abyss below, I counted myself already dead, and Thurid must have done likewise, for he evidently did not even trouble himself to look after me, but must have turned and mounted the wading flyer at once. 10 feet only I fell, and then a loop of my tough leathern harness caught upon one of the cylindrical stone projections in the tower's surface, and held. Even when I had ceased to fall, I could not believe the miracle that had preserved me from instant death, and for a moment I hung there, cold sweat exuding from every pore of my body. But when at last I had worked myself back to a firm position, I hesitated to ascend, since I could not know that Thurid was not still awaiting me above. Presently, however, there came to my ears the whirring of the propellers of a flyer, and as each moment the sound grew fainter, I realized that the party had proceeded toward the south without assuring themselves as to my fate. Cautiously I retraced my way to the roof, and I must admit that it was with no pleasant sensation that I raised my eyes once more above its edge. But to my relief, there was no one in sight, and a moment later I stood safely upon its broad surface. To reach the hangar and drag forth the only other flyer which it contained was the work of but an instant. And just as the 2 Thurn warriors, whom Mad-Eye Shang had left to prevent this very contingency, emerged upon the roof from the tower's interior, I rose above them with a taunting laugh. Then I dived rapidly to the inner court where I had last seen Wooler, and to my immense relief found the faithful beast still there. The 12 great banths lay in the doorways of their lairs, eyeing him and growling ominously, but they had not disobeyed Thuvir's injunction, and I thanked the fate that had made her their keeper within the golden cliffs, and endowed her with the kind and sympathetic nature that had won the loyalty and affection of these fierce beasts for her. Wooler leaped in frantic joy when he discovered me, and as the flyer touched the pavement of the court for a brief instant, he bounded to the deck beside me, and in the bear-like manifestation of his exuberant happiness, all but caused me to wreck the vessel against the courtyard's rocky wall. Amid the angry shouting of Thurn guardsmen, we rose high above the last fortress of the Holy Thurns, and then raced straight toward the northeast and Kaal, the destination which I had heard from the lips of Mad-Eye Shang. Far ahead, a tiny speck in the distance, I made out another flyer late in the afternoon. It could be none other than that which bore my lost love and my enemies. I had gained considerably on the craft by night, and then, knowing that they must have sighted me and would show no lights after dark, I set my destination compass upon her, that wonderful little Martian mechanism which, once attuned to the object of destination, points away toward it, irrespective of every change in its location. All that night, we raced through the Barsoomian void, passing over low hills and dead sea bottoms, above long deserted cities and populous centers of red Martian habitation, upon the ribbon-like lines of cultivated land which border the globe-encircling waterways, which Earth men call the canals of Mars. Dawn showed that I had gained appreciably upon the flyer ahead of me. It was a larger craft than mine, and not so swift, but even so, it had covered an immense distance since the flight began. The change in vegetation below showed me that we were rapidly nearing the equator. I was now near enough to my quarry to have used my bow gun, but though I could see that Dejah Thoris was not on deck, I feared to fire upon the craft which bore her. Thurid was deterred by no such scruples, and though it must have been difficult for him to believe that it was really I who followed them, he could not very well doubt the witness of his own eyes. And so he trained their stern gun upon me with his own hands, and an instant later an explosive radium projectile whizzed perilously close above my deck. The black's next shot was more accurate, striking my flyer full upon the prow and exploding with the instant of contact, ripping wide open the bow buoyancy tanks and disabling the engine. So quickly did my bow drop after the shot that I scarce had time to lash Wooler to the deck and buckle my own harness to a gunwale ring before the craft was hanging stern up and making her last long drop to ground. Her stern buoyancy tanks prevented her dropping with great rapidity, but Thurid was firing rapidly now in an attempt to burst these also, that I might be dashed to death in the swift fall that would instantly follow a successful shot. Shot after shot tore past or into us, but by a miracle neither Wooler nor I was hit, nor were the after tanks punctured. This good fortune could not last indefinitely, and assured that Thurid would not again leave me alive, I awaited the bursting of the next shell that hit, and then, throwing my hands above my head, I let go my hold and crumpled, limp and inert, dangling in my harness like a corpse. The ruse worked, and Thurid fired no more at us. Presently I heard the diminishing sound of whirring propellers and realized that again I was safe. Slowly the stricken flyer sank to the ground, and when I had freed myself and Wooler from the entangling wreckage, I found that we were upon the verge of a natural forest, so rare a thing upon the bosom of dying Mars that, outside of the forest in the valley door beside the lost Sea of Chorus, I never before had seen its like upon the planet. From books and travelers, I had learned something of the little-known land of Cael, which lies along the equator, almost halfway round the planet to the east of Helium. It comprises a sunken area of extreme tropical heat, and is inhabited by a nation of red men, varying but little in manners, customs, and appearance from the balance of the red men of Barsoom. I knew that they were among those of the outer world who still clung tenaciously to the discredited religion of the Holy Therns, and that Mad-Eye Shang would find a ready welcome and safe refuge among them, while John Carter could look for nothing better than an ignoble death at their hands. The isolation of the Caelians is rendered almost complete by the fact that no waterway connects their land with that of any other nation, nor have they any need of a waterway, since the low, swampy land, which comprises the entire area of their domain, self-waters their abundant tropical crops. For great distances in all directions, rugged hills and arid stretches of dead sea bottom discourage intercourse with them, and since there is practically no such thing as foreign commerce upon warlike Barsoom, where each nation is sufficient to itself, really little has been known relative to the court of the Jeddak of Cael and the numerous strange, but interesting, people over whom he rules. Occasional hunting parties have traveled to this out-of-the-way corner of the globe, but the hostility of the natives has usually brought disaster upon them, so that even the sport of hunting the strange and savage creatures which haunt the jungle fastnesses of Cael has of later years proved insufficient lure even to the most intrepid warriors. It was upon the verge of the land of the Caels that I now knew myself to be, but in what direction to search for Dejah Thoris, or how far into the heart of the great forest I might have to penetrate, I had not the faintest idea. But not so Wooler. Scarcely had I disentangled him than he raised his head high in air and commenced circling about at the edge of the forest. Presently he halted, and turning to see if I were following, set off straight into the maze of trees in the direction we had been going before Thurid's shot had put an end to our flyer. As best I could, I stumbled after him down a steep declivity, beginning at the forest's edge. Immense trees reared their mighty heads far above us, their broad fronds completely shutting off the slightest glimpse of the sky. It was easy to see why the Kaalians needed no navy. Their cities, hidden in the midst of this towering forest, must be entirely invisible from above, nor could a landing be made by any but the smallest flyers, and then only with the greatest risk of accident. How Thurid and Mad-Eye Shang were to land, I could not imagine, though later I was to learn that to the level of the forest top there rises in each city of Kaal a slender watchtower which guards the Kaalians by day, and by night against the secret approach of a hostile fleet. To one of these, the Hecador of the Holy Therns had no difficulty in approaching, and by its means the party was safely lowered to the ground. As Wooler and I approached the bottom of the declivity, the ground became soft and mushy, so that it was with the greatest difficulty that we made any headway whatever. Slender purple grasses topped with red and yellow fern-like fronds grew rankly all about us to the height of several feet above my head. Myriad creepers hung festooned in graceful loops from tree to tree, and among them were several varieties of the Martian manflower, whose blooms have eyes and hands with which to see and seize the insects which form their diet. The repulsive calart tree was, too, much in evidence. It is a carnivorous plant of about the bigness of a large sagebrush, such as darts our western plains. Each branch ends in a set of strong jaws, which have been known to drag down and devour large and formidable beasts of prey. Both Wooler and I had several narrow escapes from these greedy, arboreous monsters. Occasional areas of firm sod gave us intervals of rest from the arduous labor of traversing this gorgeous twilight swamp, and it was upon one of these that I finally decided to make camp for the night, which my chronometer warned me would soon be upon us. Many varieties of fruit grew in abundance about us, and as Martian callarts are omnivorous, Wooler had no difficulty in making a square meal after I had brought down the vines for him. Then, having eaten, too, I lay down with my back to that of my faithful hound and dropped into a deep and dreamless sleep. The forest was shrouded in impenetrable darkness when a low growl from Wooler awakened me. All about us I could hear the stealthy movement of great, padded feet, and now and then the wicked gleam of green eyes upon us. Arising, I drew my long sword and waited. Suddenly a deep-toned, horrid roar burst from some savage throat almost at my side. What a fool I had been not to have found safer lodgings for myself and Wooler among the branches of one of the countless trees that surrounded us. By daylight, it would have been comparatively easy to have hoisted Wooler aloft in one manner or another, but now it was too late. There was nothing for it but to stand our ground and take our medicine, though, from the hideous racket which now assailed our ears, and for which that first roar had seemed to be the signal. I judged that we must be in the midst of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the fierce, man-eating denizens of the Kaalian jungle. All the balance of the night they kept up their infernal din, but why they did not attack us I could not guess, nor am I sure to this day, unless it is that none of them ever venture upon the patches of scarlet sward which dart the swamp. When morning broke, they were still there, walking about as in a circle, but always just beyond the edge of the sward. A more terrifying aggregation of fierce and bloodthirsty monsters it would be difficult to imagine. Singly and in pairs, they commenced wandering off into the jungle shortly after sunrise, and when the last of them had departed, Wooler and I resumed our journey. Occasionally we caught glimpses of horrid beasts all during the day, but fortunately we were never far from a sward island, and when they saw us their pursuit always ended at the verge of the Salid Sard. Toward noon we stumbled upon a well-constructed road running in the general direction we had been pursuing. Everything about this highway marked it as the work of skilled engineers, and I was confident, from the indications of antiquity which it bore, as well as from the very evident signs of its being still in everyday use, that it must lead to one of the principal cities of Kaal. Just as we entered it from one side, a huge monster emerged from the jungle upon the other, and at sight of us charged madly in our direction. Imagine, if you can, a bald-faced hornet of your earthly experience grown to the size of a prize Hereford bull, and you will have some faint conception of the ferocious appearance and awesome formidability of the winged monster that bore down upon me. Frightful jaws in front and mighty, poisoned sting behind made my relatively puny longsword seem a pitiful weapon of defense indeed. Nor could I hope to escape the lightning-like movements or hide from those myriad facet eyes which covered three-fourths of the hideous head, permitting the creature to see in all directions at one and the same time. Even my powerful and ferocious Wooler was as helpless as a kitten before that frightful thing. But to flee were useless, even had it ever been to my liking to turn my back upon a danger. So I stood my ground, Wooler snarling at my side, my only hope to die as I had always lived, fighting. The creature was upon us now, and at the instant there seemed to me a single slight chance for victory. If I could but remove the terrible menace of certain death hidden in the poison sacs that fed the sting, the struggle would be less unequal. At the thought I called to Wooler to leap upon the creature's head and hang there, and as his mighty jaws closed upon that fiendish face, and glistening fangs buried themselves in the bone and cartilage and lower part of one of the huge eyes, I dived beneath the great body as the creature rose, dragging Wooler from the ground, that it might bring its sting beneath and pierce the body of the thing hanging to its head. To put myself in the path of that poison-laden lance was to court instant death, but it was the only way, and as the thing shot lightning-like toward me, I swung my long sword in a terrific cut that severed the deadly member close to the gorgeously marked body. Then, like a battering ram, one of the powerful hind legs caught me full in the chest and hurled me, half-stunned and wholly winded, clear across the broad highway and into the underbrush of the jungle that fringes it. Fortunately, I passed between the boles of trees. Had I struck one of them, I should have been badly injured, if not killed, so swiftly had I been catapulted by that enormous hind leg. Dazed though I was, I stumbled to my feet and staggered back to Wooler's assistance, to find his savage antagonist circling 10 feet above the ground, beating madly at the clinging callot with all 6 powerful legs. Even during my sudden flight through the air, I had not once released my grip upon my longsword, and now I ran beneath the 2 battling monsters, jabbing the winged terror repeatedly with its sharp point. The thing might easily have risen out of my reach, but evidently it knew as little concerning retreat in the face of danger as either Wooler or I, for it dropped quickly toward me, and before I could escape had grasped my shoulder between its powerful jaws. Time and again, the now useless stub of its giant sting struck futilely against my body, but the blows alone were almost as effective as the kick of a horse, so that when I say futilely, I refer only to the natural function of the disabled member. Eventually, the thing would have hammered me to a pulp. Nor was it far from accomplishing this when an interruption occurred that put an end forever to its hostilities. From where I hung a few feet above the road, I could see along the highway a few hundred yards to where it turned toward the east, and just as I had about given up all hope of escaping the perilous position in which I now was, I saw a red warrior come into view from around the bend. He was mounted on a splendid thoat, one of the smaller species used by red men, and in his hand was a wondrous long, light lance. His mount was walking sedately when I first perceived them, but the instant that the red man's eyes fell upon us, a word to the thoat brought the animal at full charge down upon us. The long lance of the warrior dipped toward us, and as thoat and rider hurtled beneath, the point passed through the body of our antagonist. With a convulsive shudder, the thing stiffened, the jaws relaxed, dropping me to the ground, and then, careening once in mid-air, the creature plunged head-foremost to the road, full upon Wooler, who still clung tenaciously to its gory head. By the time I had regained my feet, the red man had turned and ridden back to us. Wooler, finding his enemy inert and lifeless, released his hold at my command and wriggled from beneath the body that had covered him, and together we faced the warrior looking down upon us. I started to thank the stranger for his timely assistance, but he cut me off peremptorily. "Who are you?" he asked. "Who dare enter the land of Kaal and hunt in the royal forest of the Jeddak?" Then, as he noted my white skin through the coating of grime and blood that covered me, his eyes went wide, and in an altered tone he whispered, "Can it be that you are a holy Thurn?" I might have deceived the fellow for a time, as I had deceived others, But I had cast away the yellow wig and the holy diadem in the presence of Mad-Eye Shang, and I knew that it would not be long ere my new acquaintance discovered that I was no Thurn at all. "I am not a Thurn," I replied, and then, flinging caution to the winds, I said, "I am John Carter, Prince of Helium, whose name may not be entirely unknown to you." If his eyes had gone wide when he thought that I was a holy Thurn, they fairly popped now that he knew that I was John Carter. I grasped my longsword more firmly as I spoke the words which I was sure would precipitate an attack. But to my surprise, they precipitated nothing of the kind. "John Carter, Prince of Helium," he repeated slowly, as though he could not quite grasp the truth of the statement. "John Carter, the mightiest warrior of Barsoom." And then he dismounted and placed his hand upon my shoulder after the manner of most friendly greeting upon Mars. "It is my duty, and it should be my pleasure, to kill you, John Carter," he said, "but always in my heart of hearts have I admired your prowess and believed in your sincerity the while I have questioned and disbelieved the Therns and their religion. It would mean my instant death were my heresy to be suspected in the court of Cullen Tithe. But if I may serve you, Prince, you have but to command Torkar Bar, dwar of the Kaalian Road." Truth and honesty were writ large upon the warrior's noble countenance, so that I could not but have trusted him. Enemy though he should have been, his title of captain of the Kaalian Road explained his timely presence in the heart of the savage forest, for every highway upon Barsoom is patrolled by doughty warriors of the noble class, nor is there any service more honorable than this lonely and dangerous duty in the less frequented sections of the domains of the Red Men of Barsoom. "Torkar Bar has already placed a great debt of gratitude upon my shoulders," I replied, pointing to the carcass of the creature from whose heart he was dragging his long spear. The red man smiled. "It was fortunate that I came when I did," he said. "Only this poisoned spear, pricking the very heart of a Sith, can kill it quickly enough to save its prey. In this section of Kaal, we are all armed with a long Sith spear, whose point is smeared with the poison of the creature it is intended to kill. No other virus acts so quickly upon the beast as its own. Look," he continued, drawing his dagger and making an incision in the carcass, a foot above the root of the sting, from which he presently drew forth 2 sacks, each of which held fully a gallon of the deadly liquid. "Thus we maintain our supply, though were it not for certain commercial uses to which the virus is put, it would scarcely be necessary to add to our present store, since the Sith is almost extinct. Only occasionally do we now run upon one. Of old, however, Kaal was overrun with the frightful monsters that often came in herds of 20 or 30, darting down from above into our cities and carrying away women, children, and even warriors." As he spoke, I had been wondering just how much I might safely tell this man of the mission which brought me to his land, but his next words anticipated the broaching of the subject on my part, and rendered me thankful that I had not spoken too soon. "And now as to yourself, John Carter," he said, "I shall not ask your business here, nor do I wish to hear it. I have eyes and ears and ordinary intelligence, and yesterday morning I saw the party that came to the city of Kaal from the north in a small flyer. But one thing I ask of you, and that is, the word of John Carter that he contemplates no overt act against either the nation of Kaal or its Jeddak." "You may have my word as to that, Torkar Bar," I replied. "My way leads along the Kaalian Road, away from the city of Kaal," he continued. "I have seen no one, John Carter least of all, nor have you seen Torkar Bar nor ever heard of him. You understand?" "Perfectly," I replied. He laid his hand upon my shoulder. "This road leads directly into the city of Kaal," he said. "I wish you fortune." And vaulting to the back of his throat, he trotted away without even a backward glance. It was after dark when Wooler, and I spied through the mighty forest the great wall which surrounds the city of Kaal. We had traversed the entire way without mishap or adventure, and though the few we had met had eyed the great Kalot wonderingly, none had pierced the red pigment with which I had smoothly smeared every square inch of my body. But to traverse the surrounding country, and to enter the guarded city of Cullen Tithe, Jeddak of Kaal, were 2 very different things. No man enters a Martian city without giving a very detailed and satisfactory account of himself, nor did I delude myself with the belief that I could, for a moment, impose upon the acumen of the officers of the guard, to whom I should be taken the moment I applied at any one of the gates. My only hope seemed to lie in entering the city surreptitiously under cover of the darkness. And once in, trust to my own wits to hide myself in some crowded quarter where detection would be less liable to occur. With this idea in view, I circled the great wall, keeping within the fringe of the forest, which is cut away for a short distance from the wall all about the city, that no enemy may utilize the trees as a means of ingress. Several times I attempted to scale the barrier at different points, but not even my earthly muscles could overcome that cleverly constructed rampart. To a height of 30 feet, the face of the wall slanted outward, and then for almost an equal distance it was perpendicular, above which it slanted in again for some 15 feet to the crest, and smooth, polished glass could not be more so. Finally, I had to admit that at last I had discovered a Barsoomian fortification which I could not negotiate. Discouraged, I withdrew into the forest beside a broad highway which entered the city from the east, and with Wooler beside me lay down to sleep. Chapter 6. A Hero in Kaal. It was daylight when I was awakened by the sound of stealthy movement nearby. As I opened my eyes, Wooler, too, moved, and coming up to his haunches, stared through the intervening brush toward the road, each hair upon his neck stiffly erect. At first I could see nothing, but presently I caught a glimpse of a bit of smooth and glossy green moving among the scarlet and purple and yellow of the vegetation. Motioning Wooler to remain quietly where he was, I crept forward to investigate, and from behind the bole of a great tree I saw a long line of the hideous green warriors of the Dead Sea bottoms, hiding in the dense jungle beside the road. As far as I could see, the silent line of destruction and death stretched away from the city of Kaal. There could be but one explanation. The green men were expecting an exodus of a body of red troops from the nearest city gate, and they were lying there in ambush to leap upon them. I owed no fealty to the Jeddak of Kaal, but he was of the same race of noble red men as my own princess, and I would not stand supinely by and see his warriors butchered by the cruel and heartless demons of the waste places of Barsoom. Cautiously, I retraced my steps to where I had left Wooler, and warning him to silence, signaled him to follow me, making a considerable detour to avoid the chance of falling into the hands of the green men. I came at last to the great wall. 100 yards to my right was the gate from which the troops were evidently expected to issue, but to reach it, I must pass the flank of the green warriors within easy sight of them, and fearing that my plan to warn the Kaalians might thus be thwarted, I decided upon hastening toward the left, where another gate, a mile away, would give me ingress to the city. I knew that the word I brought would prove a splendid passport to Kaal, and I must admit that my caution was due more to my ardent desire to make my way into the city than to avoid a brush with the green men. As much as I enjoy a fight, I cannot always indulge myself, and just now I had more weighty matters to occupy my time than spilling the blood of strange warriors. Could I but win beyond the city's wall, there might be opportunity in the confusion and excitement which were sure to follow my announcement of an invading force of green warriors to find my way within the palace of the Jeddak, where I was sure Mad-Eye Shang and his party would be quartered. But scarcely had I taken 100 steps in the direction of the farther gate when the sound of marching troops, the clank of metal, and the squealing of thoats just within the city apprised me of the fact that the Kaalians were already moving toward the other gate. There was no time to be lost. In another moment the gate would be opened, and the head of the column pass out upon the death-bordered highway. Turning back toward the fateful gate, I ran rapidly along the edge of the clearing, taking the ground in the mighty leaps that had first made me famous upon Barsoom. 30, 50, 100 feet at a bound are nothing for the muscles of an athletic earthman upon Mars. As I passed the flank of the wading green men, they saw my eyes turned upon them, and in an instant, knowing that all secrecy was at an end, those nearest me sprang to their feet in an effort to cut me off before I could reach the gate. At the same instant, the mighty portal swung wide, and the head of the Kaalian column emerged. A dozen green warriors had succeeded in reaching a point between me and the gate, but they had but little idea who it was they had elected to detain. I did not slacken my speed an iota as I dashed among them, and as they fell before my blade, I could not but recall the happy memory of those other battles when Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark, mightiest of Martian green men, had stood shoulder to shoulder with me through long, hot Martian days, as together we hewed down our enemies until the pile of corpses about us rose higher than a tall man's head. when several pressed me too closely. There before the carved gateway of Kaal, I leaped above their heads, and fashioning my tactics after those of the hideous plant men of Dor, struck down upon my enemies' heads as I passed above them. From the city, the red warriors were rushing toward us, and from the jungle, the savage horde of green men were coming to meet them. In a moment, I was in the very center of as fierce and bloody a battle as I had ever passed through. These Kaalians are most noble fighters, nor are the green men of the equator one whit less warlike than their cold, cruel cousins of the temperate zone. There were many times when either side might have withdrawn without dishonor, and thus ended hostilities. But from the mad abandon with which each invariably renewed hostilities, I soon came to believe that what need not have been more than a trifling skirmish would end only with the complete extermination of one force or the other. With the joy of battle once roused within me, I took keen delight in the fray, and that my fighting was noted by the Kaalians was often evidenced by the shouts of applause directed at me. If I sometimes seem to take too great pride in my fighting ability, it must be remembered that fighting is my vocation. If your vocation be shoeing horses or painting pictures, and you can do one or the other better than your fellows, then you are a fool if you are not proud of your ability. And so I am very proud that upon 2 planets no greater fighter has ever lived than John Carter, Prince of Helium. And I outdid myself that day to impress the fact upon the natives of Kaal, for I wished to win a way into their hearts and their city. Nor was I to be disappointed in my desire. All day we fought, until the road was red with blood and clogged with corpses. Back and forth, along the slippery highway, the tide of battle surged, but never once was the gateway to Kaal really in danger. There were breathing spells when I had a chance to converse with the red men beside whom I fought, and once the Jeddak, Killen Tithe himself, laid his hand upon my shoulder and asked my name. "I am Dejah Thoris," I replied, recalling a name given me by the Tharks many years before, from the surnames of the first 2 of their warriors I had killed, which is the custom among them. "You are a mighty warrior, Dejah Thoris," he replied, "and when this day is done, I shall speak with you again in the great audience chamber." And then the fight surged upon us once more, and we were separated, but my heart's desire was attained, and it was with renewed vigor and a joyous soul that I laid about me with my longsword until the last of the green men had had enough and had withdrawn toward their distant sea bottom. Not until the battle was over did I learn why the red troops had sallied forth that day. It seemed that Killen Tithe was expecting a visit from a mighty Jeddak of the north, a powerful and the only ally of the Kaalians, and it had been his wish to meet his guest a full day's journey from Kaal. But now the march of the welcoming host was delayed until the following morning, when the troops again set out from Kaal. I had not been bidden to the presence of Killen Tithe after the battle, but he had sent an officer to find me and escort me to comfortable quarters in that part of the palace set aside for the officers of the royal guard. There, with Wooler, I had spent a comfortable night, and rose much refreshed after the arduous labors of the past few days. Wooler had fought with me through the battle of the previous day, true to the instincts and training of a Martian war dog, great numbers of which are often to be found with the savage green hordes of the Dead Sea bottoms. Neither of us had come through the conflict unscathed, but the marvelous healing salves of Barsoom had sufficed, overnight, to make us as good as new. I breakfasted with a number of the Kaalian officers, whom I found as courteous and delightful hosts as even the nobles of Helium, who are renowned for their ease of manners and excellence of breeding. The meal was scarcely concluded when a messenger arrived from Killen Tithe, summoning me before him. As I entered the royal presence, the Jeddak rose, and stepping from the dais which supported his magnificent throne, came forward to meet me, a mark of distinction that is seldom accorded to other than a visiting ruler. "Kaor, Dejah Thoris," he greeted me. "I have summoned you to receive the grateful thanks of the people of Kaal. For had it not been for your heroic bravery in daring fate to warn us of the ambuscade, we must surely have fallen into the well-laid trap. Tell me more of yourself, from what country you come, and what errand brings you to the court of Killen Tithe." "I am from Haster," I said, for in truth I had a small palace in that southern city which lies within the far-flung dominions of the Heliometic nation. My presence in the land of Kaal is partly due to accident, my flyer being wrecked upon the southern fringe of your great forest. It was while seeking entrance to the city of Kaal that I discovered the green horde lying in wait for your troops. If Cullen Tithe wondered what business brought me in a flyer to the very edge of his domain, he was good enough not to press me further for an explanation, which I should indeed have had difficulty in rendering. During my audience with the Jeddak, another party entered the chamber from behind me, so that I did not see their faces until Cullen Tithe stepped past me to greet them, commanding me to follow and be presented. As I turned toward them, it was with difficulty that I controlled my features, for there, listening to Cullen Tithe's eulogistic words concerning me, stood my archenemies, Mad-Eye Shang and Thurid. "Holy Hecador of the Holy Therns," the Jeddak was saying, "shower thy blessings upon Dara Sarjat, the valorous stranger from distant Haster, whose wondrous heroism and marvelous ferocity saved the day for Kaal yesterday." Shang stepped forward and laid his hand upon my shoulder. No slightest indication that he recognized me showed upon his countenance. My disguise was evidently complete. He spoke kindly to me and then presented me to Thurid. The black, too, was evidently entirely deceived. Then Cullen Tithe regaled them, much to my amusement, with details of my achievements upon the field of battle. The thing that seemed to have impressed him most was my remarkable agility, and time and again he described the wondrous way in which I had leaped completely over an antagonist, cleaving his skull wide open with my longsword as I passed above him. I thought that I saw Thurid's eyes widen a bit during the narrative, and several times I surprised him gazing intently into my face through narrowed lids. Was he commencing to suspect? And then Cullen Tithe told of the savage Calart that fought beside me, and after that I saw suspicion in the eyes of Mad-Eye Shang, or did I but imagine it? At the close of the audience, Cullen Tithe announced that he would have me accompany him upon the way to meet his royal guest, and as I departed with an officer who was to procure proper trappings and a suitable mount for me, both Mad-Eye Shang and Thurid seemed most sincere in professing their pleasure at having had an opportunity to know me. It was with a sigh of relief that I quitted the chamber, convinced that nothing more than a guilty conscience had prompted my belief that either of my enemies suspected my true identity. A half-hour later, I rode out of the city gate with the column that accompanied Cullen Tithe upon the way to meet his friend and ally. Though my eyes and ears had been wide open during my audience with the Jeddak and my various passages through the palace, I had seen or heard nothing of Dejah Thoris or Thuvia of Tarth. That they must be somewhere within the great rambling edifice I was positive, and I should have given much to have found a way to remain behind during Cullen Tithe's absence, that I might search for them. Toward noon, we came in touch with the head of the column we had set out to meet. It was a gorgeous train that accompanied the visiting Jeddak, and for miles it stretched along the wide, white road to Kaal. Mounted troops, their trappings of jewel and metal-encrusted leather glistening in the sunlight, formed the vanguard of the body, and then came 1,000 gorgeous chariots drawn by huge zididars. These low, commodious wagons moved two abreast, and on either side of them marched solid ranks of mounted warriors, for in the chariots were the women and children of the royal court. Upon the back of each monster, Zididar rode a Martian youth, and the whole scene carried me back to my first days upon Barsoom, now 22 years in the past, when I had first beheld the gorgeous spectacle of a caravan of the green horde of Tharks. Never before today had I seen Zididars in the service of red men. These brutes are huge Macedonian animals that tower to an immense height, even beside the giant green men and their giant thoats. But when compared to the relatively small red man and his breed of thoats, they assume Brobdingnagian proportions that are truly appalling. The beasts were hung with jeweled trappings and saddle pads of gay silk, embroidered in fanciful designs with strings of diamonds, pearls, rubies, emeralds, and the countless unnamed jewels of Mars, while from each chariot rose a dozen standards from which streamers, flags, and pennons fluttered in the breeze. Just in front of the chariots, the visiting Jeddak rode alone upon a pure white thoat, another unusual sight upon Barsoom, and after them came interminable ranks of mounted spearmen, riflemen, and swordsmen. It was indeed a most imposing sight. Except for the clanking of accoutrements and the occasional squeal of an angry thoat or the low guttural of a zididar, the passage of the cavalcade was almost noiseless, For neither Thoth nor Zididar is a hoofed animal, and the broad tires of the chariots are of an elastic composition, which gives forth no sound. Now and then the gay laughter of a woman or the chatter of children could be heard, for the Red Martians are a social, pleasure-loving people, in direct antithesis to the cold and morbid race of green men. The forms and ceremonials connected with the meeting of the two Jedaks consumed an hour, and then we turned and retraced our way toward the city of Kaal, which the head of the column reached just before dark, though it must have been nearly morning before the rear guard passed through the gateway. Fortunately, I was well up toward the head of the column, and after the great banquet, which I attended with the officers of the Royal Guard, I was free to seek repose. There was so much activity and bustle about the palace, all during the night, with the constant arrival of the noble officers of the visiting Jedak's retinue, that I dared not attempt to prosecute a search for Dejah Thoris. And so, as soon as it was seemly for me to do so, I returned to my quarters. As I passed along the corridors between the banquet hall and the apartments that had been allotted me, I had a sudden feeling that I was under surveillance, and turning quickly in my tracks, caught a glimpse of a figure which darted into an open doorway the instant I wheeled about. Though I ran quickly back to the spot where the shadower had disappeared, I could find no trace of him. Yet in the brief glimpse that I had caught, I could have sworn that I had seen a white face surmounted by a mass of yellow hair. The incident gave me considerable food for speculation, since if I were right in the conclusion induced by the cursory glimpse I had had of the spy, then Mad-Eye Shang and Thurid must suspect my identity, and if that were true, not even the service I had rendered Cullen Tithe could save me from his religious fanaticism. But never did vague conjecture or fruitless fears for the future lie with sufficient weight upon my mind to keep me from my rest, and so tonight I threw myself upon my sleeping silks and furs, and passed at once into dreamless slumber. Calots are not permitted within the walls of the palace proper, and so I had had to relegate poor Wooler to quarters in the stables where the royal thoats are kept. He had comfortable, even luxurious apartments, but I would have given much to have had him with me, and if he had been, the thing which happened that night would not have come to pass. I could not have slept over a quarter of an hour when I was suddenly awakened by the passing of some cold and clammy thing across my forehead. Instantly I sprang to my feet, clutching in the direction I thought the presence lay. For an instant my hand touched against human flesh, and then, as I lunged headforemost through the darkness to seize my nocturnal visitor, my foot became entangled in my sleeping silks, and I fell sprawling to the floor. By the time I had resumed my feet and found the button which controlled the light, my caller had disappeared. Careful search of the room revealed nothing to explain either the identity or business of the person who had thus secretly sought me in the dead of night. That the purpose might be theft I could not believe, since thieves are practically unknown upon Barsoom. Assassination, however, is rampant, but even this could not have been the motive of my stealthy friend, for he might easily have killed me had he desired. I had about given up fruitless conjecture, and was on the point of returning to sleep when a dozen Kaalian guardsmen entered my apartment. The officer in charge was one of my genial hosts of the morning, but now upon his face was no sign of friendship. "Cullen Tithe commands your presence before him," he said. "Come." Chapter 7. New Allies. Surrounded by guardsmen, I marched back along the corridors of the palace of Cullen Tithe, Jedak of Kaal, to the great audience chamber in the center of the massive structure. As I entered the brilliantly lighted apartment, filled with the nobles of Kaal and the officers of the visiting Jedak, all eyes were turned upon me. Upon the great dais at the end of the chamber stood 3 thrones, upon which sat Cullen Tithe and his 2 guests, Mad-Eye Shang, and the visiting Jedak. Up the broad center aisle we marched beneath deadly silence, and at the foot of the thrones we halted. "Prefer thy charge," said Cullen Tithe, turning to one who stood among the nobles at his right, and then Thurid, the black Dejah of the firstborn, stepped forward and faced me. "Most noble Jedak," he said, addressing Cullen Tithe, "from the first I suspected this stranger within thy palace. Your description of his fiendish prowess tallied with that of the arch-enemy of truth upon Barsoom. But that there might be no mistake, I dispatched a priest of your own holy cult to make the test that should pierce his disguise and reveal the truth. Behold the result." And Thurid pointed a rigid finger at my forehead. All eyes followed the direction of that accusing digit. I alone seemed at a loss to guess what fatal sign rested upon my brow. The officer beside me guessed my perplexity, and as the brows of Killen Tithe darkened in a menacing scowl as his eyes rested upon me, the noble drew a small mirror from his pocket pouch and held it before my face. One glance at the reflection it gave back to me was sufficient. From my forehead, the hand of the sneaking Thurn had reached out through the concealing darkness of my bedchamber and wiped away a patch of the disguising red pigment as broad as my palm. Beneath showed the tan texture of my own white skin. For a moment Thurid ceased speaking, to enhance, I suspect, the dramatic effect of his disclosure. Then he resumed. "Hear, O Killen Tithe," he cried, "is he who has desecrated the temples of the gods of Mars, who has violated the persons of the holy Therns themselves and turned a world against its age-old religion. Before you in your power, Jeddak of Kaal, defender of the holies, stands John Carter, Prince of Helium." Killen Tithe looked toward Mad-Eye Shang as, though for corroboration of these charges, the holy Thurn nodded his head. "It is indeed the arch-blasphemer," he said. "Even now he has followed me to the very heart of thy palace, Killen Tithe, for the sole purpose of assassinating me." He lies," I cried. "Killen Tithe, listen that you may know the truth. Listen while I tell you why John Carter has followed Mad-Eye Shang to the heart of thy palace. Listen to me as well as to them, and then judge if my acts be not more in accord with true Barsoomian chivalry and honor than those of these revengeful devotees of the spurious creeds from whose cruel bonds I have freed your planet." "Silence!" roared the Jeddak, leaping to his feet and laying his hand upon the hilt of his sword. "Silence, blasphemer! Killen Tithe need not permit the air of his audience chamber to be defiled by the heresies that issue from your polluted throat to judge you. You stand already self-condemned. It but remains to determine the manner of your death. Even the service that you rendered the arms of Kaal shall avail you naught. It was but a base subterfuge, whereby you might win your way into my favor and reach the side of this holy man whose life you craved. To the pits with him," he concluded, addressing the officer of my guard. Here was a pretty pass indeed. What chance had I against a whole nation? What hope for me of mercy at the hands of the fanatical Killen Tithe with such advisers as Mad-Eye Shang and Thurid? The black grinned malevolently in my face. "You shall not escape this time, Earthman," he taunted. The guards closed toward me. A red haze blurred my vision. The fighting blood of my Virginian sires coursed hot through my veins. The lust of battle in all its mad fury was upon me. With a leap I was beside Thurid, and ere the devilish smirk had faded from his handsome face, I had caught him full upon the mouth with my clenched fist. And as the good, old American blow landed, the black Dejah shot back a dozen feet, to crumple in a heap at the foot of Killen Tithe's throne, spitting blood and teeth from his hurt mouth. Then I drew my sword and swung round on guard to face a nation. In an instant the guardsmen were upon me, but before a blow had been struck a mighty voice rose above the din of shouting warriors, and a giant figure leaped from the dais beside Killen Tithe, and with drawn longsword threw himself between me and my adversaries. It was the visiting Jeddak. "Hold," he cried, "if you value my friendship, Killen Tithe, and the age-old peace that has existed between our peoples, call off your swordsmen. For wherever or against whomsoever fights, John Carter, Prince of Helium, there beside him, and to the death fights Thuvan Din, Jeddak of Tarth." The shouting ceased, and the menacing points were lowered as 1,000 eyes turned first toward Thuvan Din in surprise, and then toward Killen Tithe in question. At first the Jeddak of Kaal went white in rage, but before he spoke he had mastered himself, so that his tone was calm and even as befitted intercourse between two great Jeddaks. "Thuvan Din," he said slowly, "must have great provocation thus to desecrate the ancient customs which inspire the deportment of a guest within the palace of his host. Lest I, too, should forget myself, as has my royal friend, I should prefer to remain silent until the Jeddak of Tarth has won from me applause for his action by relating the causes which provoked it." I could see that the Jeddak of Tarth was of half a mind to throw his metal in Killen Tithe's face, but he controlled himself even as well as had his host. "None knows better than Thuvan Din," he said, "the laws which govern the acts of men in the domains of their neighbors. But Thuvan Din owes allegiance to a higher law than these, the law of gratitude. Nor to any man upon Barsoom does he owe a greater debt of gratitude than to John Carter, Prince of Helium. Years ago, Killen Tithe, he continued. Upon the occasion of your last visit to me, you were greatly taken with the charms and graces of my only daughter, Thuvia. You saw how I adored her, and later you learned that, inspired by some unfathomable whim, she had taken the last, long, voluntary pilgrimage upon the cold bosom of the mysterious Iss, leaving me desolate. Some months ago, I first heard of the expedition which John Carter had led against Issus and the Holy Therns. Faint rumors of the atrocities reported to have been committed by the Therns upon those who for countless ages have floated down the mighty Iss came to my ears. I heard that thousands of prisoners had been released, few of whom dared to return to their own countries owing to the mandate of terrible death which rests against all who return from the valley door. For a time, I could not believe the heresies which I heard, and I prayed that my daughter Thuvia might have died before she ever committed the sacrilege of returning to the outer world. But then my father's love asserted itself, and I vowed that I would prefer eternal damnation to further separation from her if she could be found. So I sent emissaries to Helium, and to the court of Zadar, Jeddak of the firstborn, and to him who now rules those of the Thern nation that have renounced their religion. And from each and all I heard the same story of unspeakable cruelties and atrocities perpetrated upon the poor defenseless victims of their religion by the holy Therns. Many there were who had seen or known my daughter, and from Therns who had been close to Mad-Eye Shang, I learned of the indignities that he personally heaped upon her. And I was glad when I came here to find that Mad-Eye Shang was also your guest, for I should have sought him out had it taken a lifetime. More, too, I heard, and that of the chivalrous kindness that John Carter had accorded my daughter. They told me how he fought for her and rescued her, and how he spurned escape from the savage war-hoons of the south, sending her to safety upon his own throat, and remaining upon foot to meet the green warriors. Can you wonder, Tithe, that I am willing to jeopardize my life, the peace of my nation, or even your friendship, which I prize more than aught else, to champion the Prince of Helium? For a moment Tithe was silent. I could see by the expression of his face that he was sore perplexed. Then he spoke. Thuvan Din, he said, and his tone was friendly though sad. Who am I to judge my fellow man? In my eyes the father of Therns is still holy, and the religion which he teaches the only true religion. But were I faced by the same problem that has vexed you, I doubt not that I should feel and act precisely as you have. In so far as the Prince of Helium is concerned, I may act. But between you and Mad-Eye Shang, my only office can be one of conciliation. The Prince of Helium shall be escorted in safety to the boundary of my domain ere the sun has set again, where he shall be free to go whither he will. But upon pain of death must he never again enter the land of Kaal. If there be a quarrel between you and the father of Therns, I need not ask that the settlement of it be deferred until both have passed beyond the limits of my power. Are you satisfied, Thuvan Din? The Jeddak of Tarth nodded his assent, but the ugly scowl that he bent upon Mad-Eye Shang harbored ill for that pasty-faced godling. The Prince of Helium is far from satisfied, I cried, breaking rudely in upon the beginnings of peace, for I had no stomach for peace at the price that had been named. I have escaped death in a dozen forms to follow Mad-Eye Shang and overtake him, and I do not intend to be led, like a decrepit thoat to the slaughter, from the goal that I have won by the prowess of my sword arm and the might of my muscles. Nor will Thuvan Din, Jeddak of Tarth, be satisfied when he has heard me through. You know why I have followed Mad-Eye Shang and Thurid, the Black Dejah, from the forests of the Valley Door across half a world through almost insurmountable difficulties. Think you that John Carter, Prince of Helium, would stoop to assassination? Can Tithe be such a fool as to believe that lie, whispered in his ear by the holy Thern or Dejah Thurid? I do not follow Mad-Eye Shang to kill him, though the god of mine own planet knows that my hands itch to be at his throat. I follow him, Thuvan Din, because with him are two prisoners, my wife, Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, and your daughter, Thuvia of Tarth. Now think you that I shall permit myself to be led beyond the walls of Kaal unless the mother of my son accompanies me, and thy daughter be restored? Thuvan Din turned upon Tithe. Rage flamed in his keen eyes, but by the masterfulness of his self-control, he kept his tones level as he spoke. Knew you this thing? Tithe, he asked. Knew you that my daughter lay a prisoner in your palace? He could not know it, interrupted Mad-Eye Shang, white with what I am sure was more fear than rage. He could not know it, for it is a lie. I would have had his life for that upon the spot, but even as I sprang toward him, Thuvan Dihan laid a heavy hand upon my shoulder. "Wait," he said to me, and then to Cullen Tithe. "It is not a lie. This much have I learned of the Prince of Helium. He does not lie. Answer me, Cullen Tithe. I have asked you a question." "3 women came with the father of Therns," replied Cullen Tithe. "Fedor, his daughter, and 2 who were reported to be her slaves. If these be Thuvia of Tarth and Dejah Thoris of Helium, I did not know it. I have seen neither. But if they be, then shall they be returned to you on the morrow." As he spoke, he looked straight at Mad-Eye Shang, not as a devotee should look at a high priest, but as a ruler of men looks at one to whom he issues a command. It must have been plain to the father of Therns, as it was to me, that the recent disclosures of his true character had done much already to weaken the faith of Cullen Tithe, and that it would require but little more to turn the powerful Jeddak into an avowed enemy. But so strong are the seeds of superstition that even the great Kaalian still hesitated to cut the final strand that bound him to his ancient religion. Mad-Eye Shang was wise enough to seem to accept the mandate of his follower and promised to bring the 2 slave women to the audience chamber on the morrow. "It is almost morning now," he said, "and I should dislike to break in upon the slumber of my daughter, or I would have them fetched at once that you might see that the Prince of Helium is mistaken." And he emphasized the last word in an effort to affront me so subtly that I could not take open offense. I was about to object to any delay and demand that the Princess of Helium be brought to me forthwith, when Thuvan Dihan made such insistence seem unnecessary. "I should like to see my daughter at once," he said, "but if Cullen Tithe will give me his assurance that none will be permitted to leave the palace this night, and that no harm shall befall either Dejah Thoris or Thuvia of Tarth between now and the moment they are brought into our presence in this chamber at daylight, I shall not insist." "None shall leave the palace tonight," replied the Jeddak of Kaal, "and Mad-Eye Shang will give us assurance that no harm will come to the 2 women." The Thern assented with a nod. A few moments later, Cullen Tithe indicated that the audience was at an end, and at Thuvan Dihan's invitation, I accompanied the Jeddak of Tarth to his own apartments, where we sat until daylight, while he listened to the account of my experiences upon his planet and to all that had befallen his daughter during the time that we had been together. I found the father of Thuvia a man after my own heart, and that night saw the beginning of a friendship which has grown until it is second only to that which obtains between Tars Tarkas, the green Jeddak of Thark, and myself. The first burst of Mars's sudden dawn brought messengers from Cullen Tithe, summoning us to the audience chamber where Thuvan Dihan was to receive his daughter after years of separation, and I was to be reunited with the glorious daughter of Helium after an almost unbroken separation of 12 years. My heart pounded within my bosom until I looked about me in embarrassment. So sure was I that all within the room must hear. My arms ached to enfold once more the divine form of her, whose eternal youth and undying beauty were but outward manifestations of a perfect soul. At last, the messenger dispatched to fetch Mad-Eye Shang returned. I craned my neck to catch the first glimpse of those who should be following, but the messenger was alone. Halting before the throne, he addressed his Jeddak in a voice that was plainly audible to all within the chamber. "O Cullen Tithe, mightiest of Jeddaks," he cried, after the fashion of the court, "your messenger returns alone, for when he reached the apartments of the father of Therns he found them empty, as were those occupied by his suite." Cullen Tithe went white. A low groan burst from the lips of Thuvan Dihan, who stood next to me, not having ascended the throne which awaited him beside his host. For a moment, the silence of death reigned in the great audience chamber of Cullen Tithe, Jeddak of Kaal. It was he who broke the spell. Rising from his throne, he stepped down from the dais to the side of Thuvan Dihan. Tears dimmed his eyes as he placed both his hands upon the shoulders of his friend. "O Thuvan Dihan," he cried, "that this should have happened in the palace of thy best friend. With my own hands would I have wrung the neck of Mad-Eye Shang had I guessed what was in his foul heart. Last night my lifelong faith was weakened. This morning it has been shattered. But too late, to wrest your daughter and the wife of this royal warrior from the clutches of these archfiends you have, but to command the resources of a mighty nation. For all Kaal is at your disposal. What may be done? Say the word." "First," I suggested, "let us find those of your people who be responsible for the escape of Mad-Eye Shang and his followers." Without assistance on the part of the palace guard, this thing could not have come to pass. Seek the guilty, and from them force an explanation of the manner of their going and the direction they have taken. Before Cullen Tithe could issue the commands that would initiate the investigation, a handsome young officer stepped forward and addressed his Jeddak. "O Cullen Tithe, mightiest of Jeddaks," he said, "I alone be responsible for this grievous error. Last night it was I who commanded the palace guard, was on duty in other parts of the palace during the audience of the early morning, and knew nothing of what transpired then, so that when the father of Therns summoned me, and explained that it was your wish that his party be hastened from the city, because of the presence here of a deadly enemy who sought the holy Hecador's life, I did only what a lifetime of training has taught me was the proper thing to do. I obeyed him, whom I believed to be the ruler of us all, mightier even than thou, mightiest of Jeddaks. Let the consequences and the punishment fall on me alone, for I alone am guilty. Those others of the palace guard who assisted in the flight did so under my instructions." Cullen Tithe looked first at me, and then at Thuvan Dihin, as though to ask our judgment upon the man, but the error was so evidently excusable that neither of us had any mind to see the young officer suffer from mistake that any might readily have made. "How left they?" asked Thuvan Dihin, "and what direction did they take?" "They left as they came," replied the officer, "upon their own flyer. For some time after they had departed, I watched the vessel's lights, which vanished finally due north." "Where north could Madai Shang find an asylum?" asked Thuvan Dihin of Cullen Tithe. For some moments the Jeddak of Kaal stood with bowed head, apparently deep in thought. Then a sudden light brightened his countenance. "I have it," he cried. "Only yesterday Madai Shang let drop a hint of his destination, telling me of a race of people unlike ourselves who dwell far to the north. They, he said, had always been known to the holy Therns and were devout and faithful followers of the ancient cult. Among them would he find a perpetual haven of refuge, where no lying heretics might seek him out. It is there that Madai Shang has gone. And in all Kaal there be no flyer wherein to follow," I cried. "Nor nearer than Tarth," replied Thuvan Dihin. "Wait," I exclaimed. "Beyond the southern fringe of this great forest lies the wreck of the Thurn flyer which brought me that far upon my way. If you will loan me men to fetch it, and artificers to assist me, I can repair it in 2 days." Cullen Tithe. I had been more than half suspicious of the seeming sincerity of the Kaalian Jeddak's sudden apostasy, but the alacrity with which he embraced my suggestion, and the dispatch with which a force of officers and men were placed at my disposal, entirely removed the last vestige of my doubts. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 2 days later, the flyer rested upon the top of the watchtower, ready to depart. Thuvan Dihin and Cullen Tithe had offered me the entire resources of 2 nations. Millions of fighting men were at my disposal, but my flyer could hold but one other than myself and Wooler. As I stepped aboard her, Thuvan Dihin took his place beside me. I cast a look of questioning surprise upon him. He turned to the highest of his own officers who had accompanied him to Kaal. "To you I entrust the return of my retinue to Tarth," he said. "There my son rules ably in my absence. The Prince of Helium shall not go alone into the land of his enemies. I have spoken. Farewell." Chapter 8. Through the Carrion Caves. Straight toward the north, day and night, our destination compass led us after the fleeing flyer upon which it had remained set since I first attuned it after leaving the Thurn fortress. Early in the second night, we noticed the air becoming perceptibly colder, and from the distance we had come from the equator were assured that we were rapidly approaching the North Arctic region. My knowledge of the efforts that had been made by countless expeditions to explore that unknown land bade me to caution, for never had a flyer returned who had passed to any considerable distance beyond the mighty ice barrier that fringes the southern hem of the frigid zone. What became of them none knew, only that they passed forever out of the sight of man into that grim and mysterious country of the pole. The distance from the barrier to the pole was no more than a swift flyer should cover in a few hours, and so it was assumed that some frightful catastrophe awaited those who reached the Forbidden Land, as it had come to be called by the Martians of the outer world. Thus it was that I went more slowly as we approached the barrier, for it was my intention to move cautiously by day over the iceback that I might discover, before I had run into a trap, if there really lay an inhabited country at the North Pole, For there only could I imagine a spot where Mad-Eye Sheng might feel secure from John Carter, Prince of Helium. We were flying at a snail's pace, but a few feet above the ground, literally feeling our way along through the darkness, for both moons had set, and the night was black with the clouds that are to be found only at Mars's two extremities. Suddenly a towering wall of white rose directly in our path, and though I threw the helm hard over and reversed our engine, I was too late to avoid collision. With a sickening crash, we struck the high, looming obstacle 3/4 on. The flyer reeled half over, the engine stopped. As one, the patched buoyancy tanks burst, and we plunged, head foremost, to the ground 20 feet beneath. Fortunately, none of us was injured, and when we had disentangled ourselves from the wreckage, and the lesser moon had burst again from below the horizon, we found that we were at the foot of a mighty ice barrier, from which outcropped great patches of the granite hills which hold it from encroaching farther toward the south. What fate! With the journey all but completed to be thus wrecked upon the wrong side of that precipitous and unscalable wall of rock and ice. I looked at Thuvan Din. He but shook his head dejectedly. The balance of the night we spent shivering in our inadequate sleeping silks and furs upon the snow that lies at the foot of the ice barrier. With daylight, my battered spirits regained something of their accustomed hopefulness, though I must admit that there was little enough for them to feed upon. "What shall we do?" asked Thuvan Din. "How may we pass that which is impassable?" "First, we must disprove its impassability," I replied. "Nor shall I admit that it is impassable before I have followed its entire circle and stand again upon this spot, defeated. The sooner we start, the better, for I see no other way, and it will take us more than a month to travel the weary, frigid miles that lie before us." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. For 5 days of cold and suffering and privation, we traversed the rough and frozen way which lies at the foot of the ice barrier. Fierce, fur-bearing creatures attacked us by daylight and by dark. Never for a moment were we safe from the sudden charge of some huge demon of the north. The Apt was our most consistent and dangerous foe. It is a huge, white-furred creature with 6 limbs, 4 of which, short and heavy, carry it swiftly over the snow and ice, while the other 2, growing forward from its shoulders on either side of its long, powerful neck, terminate in white, hairless hands, with which it seizes and holds its prey. Its head and mouth are more similar in appearance to those of a hippopotamus than to any other earthly animal, except that from the sides of the lower jawbone, 2 mighty horns curve slightly downward toward the front. Its 2 huge eyes inspired my greatest curiosity. They extend in 2 vast, oval patches from the center of the top of the cranium down either side of the head to below the roots of the horns, so that these weapons really grow out from the lower part of the eyes, which are composed of several thousand archeli each. This eye structure seemed remarkable in a beast whose haunts were upon a glaring field of ice and snow, and though I found upon minute examination of several that we killed that each ocelus is furnished with its own lid, and that the animal can at will close as many of the facets of his huge eyes as he chooses. Yet I was positive that nature had thus equipped him, because much of his life was to be spent in dark, subterranean recesses. Shortly after this, we came upon the hugest Apt that we had seen. The creature stood fully 8 feet at the shoulder, and was so sleek and clean and glossy that I could have sworn that he had but recently been groomed. He stood head-on eyeing us as we approached him, for we had found it a waste of time to attempt to escape the perpetual bestial rage which seems to possess these demon creatures who rove the dismal north, attacking every living thing that comes within the scope of their far-seeing eyes. Even when their bellies are full and they can eat no more, they kill purely for the pleasure which they derive from taking life. And so when this particular Apt failed to charge us, and instead wheeled and trotted away as we neared him, I should have been greatly surprised had I not chanced to glimpse the sheen of a golden collar about its neck. Thuvan Din saw it too, and it carried the same message of hope to us both. Only man could have placed that collar there, and as no race of Martians of which we knew aught ever had attempted to domesticate the ferocious Apt, he must belong to a people of the north of whose very existence we were ignorant, possibly to the fabled yellow men of Barsoom, that once powerful race which was supposed to be extinct, though sometimes, by theorists, thought still to exist in the frozen north. Simultaneously, we started upon the trail of the great beast. Wooler was quickly made to understand our desires, so that it was unnecessary to attempt to keep in sight of the animal, whose swift flight over the rough ground soon put him beyond our vision. For the better part of 2 hours, the trail paralleled the barrier, and then suddenly turned toward it through the roughest and seemingly most impassable country I ever had beheld. Enormous granite boulders blocked the way on every hand. Deep rifts in the ice threatened to engulf us at the least misstep, and from the north, a slight breeze wafted to our nostrils an unspeakable stench that almost choked us. For another 2 hours, we were occupied in traversing a few hundred yards to the foot of the barrier. Then, turning about the corner of a wall-like outcropping of granite, we came upon a smooth area of 2 or 3 acres before the base of the towering pile of ice and rock that had baffled us for days, and before us beheld the dark and cavernous mouth of a cave. From this repelling portal the horrid stench was emanating, and as Thuvin Dihin espied the place he halted with an exclamation of profound astonishment. "By all my ancestors," he ejaculated, "that I should have lived to witness the reality of the fabled Carrion Caves. If these indeed be they, we have found a way beyond the ice barrier." The ancient chronicles of the first historians of Barsoom, so ancient that we have for ages considered them mythology, record the passing of the Yellow Men from the ravages of the green hordes that overran Barsoom as the drying up of the great oceans drove the dominant races from their strongholds. They tell of the wanderings of the remnants of this once powerful race, harassed at every step, until at last they found a way through the ice barrier of the north to a fertile valley at the pole. At the opening to the subterranean passage that led to their haven of refuge, a mighty battle was fought in which the Yellow Men were victorious, and within the caves that gave ingress to their new home, they piled the bodies of the dead, both yellow and green, that the stench might warn away their enemies from further pursuit. And ever since that long-gone day have the dead of this fabled land been carried to the Carrion Caves, that in death and decay they might serve their country and warn away invading enemies. Here, too, is brought, so the fable runs, all the waste stuff of the nation, everything that is subject to rot, and that can add to the foul stench that assails our nostrils. And death lurks at every step among rotting dead, for here the fierce apes lair, adding to the putrid accumulation with the fragments of their own prey which they cannot devour. It is a horrid avenue to our goal, but it is the only one. "You are sure, then, that we have found the way to the land of the Yellow Men?" I cried. "As sure as may be," he replied, having only ancient legend to support my belief. "But see how closely, so far, each detail tallies with the world-old story of the Hegira of the Yellow race. Yes, I am sure that we have discovered the way to their ancient hiding place. If it be true, and let us pray that such may be the case," I said, "then here may we solve the mystery of the disappearance of Tardo's Moors, Jedak of Helium, and Moors Kajak, his son, for no other spot upon Barsoom has remained unexplored by the many expeditions and the countless spies that have been searching for them for nearly 2 years. The last word that came from them was that they sought Thoris, my own brave son, beyond the ice barrier. As we talked, we had been approaching the entrance to the cave, and as we crossed the threshold, I ceased to wonder that the ancient green enemies of the Yellow Men had been halted by the horrors of that awful way. The bones of dead men lay man-high upon the broad floor of the first cave, and over all was a putrid mush of decaying flesh, through which the apes had beaten a hideous trail toward the entrance to the second cave beyond. The roof of this first apartment was low, like all that we traversed subsequently, so that the foul odors were confined and condensed to such an extent that they seemed to possess tangible substance. One was almost tempted to draw his short sword and hew his way through in search of pure air beyond. "Can man breathe this polluted air alive?" asked Thuvin Din, choking. "Not for long, I imagine," I replied. "So let us make haste. I will go first, and you bring up the rear with Wooler between. Come." And with the words I dashed forward, across the fetid mass of putrefaction. It was not until we had passed through 7 caves of different sizes, and varying but little in the power and quality of their stenches, that we met with any physical opposition. Then, within the 8th cave, we came upon a lair of apes. A full score of the mighty beasts were disposed about the chamber. Some were sleeping, while others tore at the fresh-killed carcasses of new-brought prey, or fought among themselves in their love-making. Here, in the dim light of their subterranean home, the value of their great eyes was apparent, for these inner caves are shrouded in perpetual gloom that is but little less than utter darkness. To attempt to pass through the midst of that fierce herd seemed, even to me, the height of folly, and so I proposed to Thuvan Dihin that he return to the outer world with Woola, that the two might find their way to civilization and come again with a sufficient force to overcome not only the apts, but any further obstacles that might lie between us and our goal. In the meantime, I continued, I may discover some means of winning my way alone to the land of the yellow men. But if I am unsuccessful, one life only will have been sacrificed. Should we all go on and perish, there will be none to guide a succoring party to Dejah Thoris and your daughter. I shall not return and leave you here alone, John Carter, replied Thuvan Dihin. Whether you go on to victory or death, the Jeddak of Tarth remains at your side. I have spoken. I knew from his tone that it were useless to attempt to argue the question, and so I compromised by sending Woola back with a hastily penned note enclosed in a small metal case and fastened about his neck. I commanded the faithful creature to seek Carthoris at Helium, and though half a world and countless dangers lay between, I knew that if the thing could be done, Woola would do it. Equipped, as he was by nature, with marvelous speed and endurance, and with frightful ferocity that made him a match for any single enemy of the way, his keen intelligence and wondrous instinct should easily furnish all else that was needed for the successful accomplishment of his mission. It was with evident reluctance that the great beast turned to leave me in compliance with my command, and ere he had gone, I could not resist the inclination to throw my arms about his great neck in a parting hug. He rubbed his cheek against mine in a final caress, and a moment later was speeding through the carrion caves toward the outer world. In my note to Carthoris, I had given explicit directions for locating the carrion caves, impressing upon him the necessity for making entrance to the country beyond through this avenue, and not to attempt under any circumstances to cross the ice barrier with a fleet. I told him that what lay beyond the 8th cave I could not even guess, but I was sure that somewhere upon the other side of the ice barrier his mother lay in the power of Mad-Eye Shang, and that possibly his grandfather and great-grandfather as well, if they lived. Further, I advised him to call upon Cullen Tithe and the son of Thuvan Dihin for warriors and ships, that the expedition might be sufficiently strong to ensure success at the first blow. And I concluded, if there be time, bring Tarkas with you, for if I live until you reach me, I can think of few greater pleasures than to fight once more, shoulder to shoulder, with my old friend. When Woola had left us, Thuvan Dihin and I, hiding in the 7th cave, discussed and discarded many plans for crossing the 8th chamber. From where we stood, we saw that the fighting among the apts was growing less, and that many that had been feeding had ceased and lain down to sleep. Presently it became apparent that in a short time all the ferocious monsters might be peacefully slumbering, and thus a hazardous opportunity be presented to us to cross through their lair. One by one, the remaining brutes stretched themselves upon the bubbling decomposition that covered the mass of bones upon the floor of their den, until but a single apt remained awake. This huge fellow roamed restlessly about, nosing among his companion and the abhorrent litter of the cave. Occasionally he would stop to peer intently toward first one of the exits from the chamber and then the other. His whole demeanor was as of one who acts as sentry. We were at last forced to the belief that he would not sleep while the other occupants of the lair slept, and so cast about in our minds for some scheme whereby we might trick him. Finally, I suggested a plan to Thuvan Dihin, and as it seemed as good as any that we had discussed, we decided to put it to the test. To this end, Thuvan Dihin placed himself close against the cave's wall, beside the entrance to the 8th chamber, while I deliberately showed myself to the guardian apt as he looked toward our retreat. Then I sprang to the opposite side of the entrance, flattening my body close to the wall. Without a sound, the great beast moved rapidly toward the 7th cave to see what manner of intruder had thus rashly penetrated so far within the precincts of his habitation. As he poked his head through the narrow aperture that connects the two caves, a heavy longsword was awaiting him upon either hand, and before he had an opportunity to emit even a single growl, his severed head rolled at our feet. Quickly, we glanced into the 8th chamber. Not an apt had moved. Crawling over the carcass of the huge beast that blocked the doorway, Thuvan Dihin and I cautiously entered the forbidding and dangerous den. Like snails, we wound our silent and careful way among the huge, recumbent forms. The only sound above our breathing was the sucking noise of our feet as we lifted them from the ooze of decaying flesh through which we crept. Halfway across the chamber, and one of the mighty beasts directly before me moved restlessly at the very instant that my foot was poised above his head, over which I must step. Breathlessly I waited, balancing upon one foot, for I did not dare move a muscle. In my right hand was my keen short sword, the point hovering an inch above the thick fur beneath which beat the savage heart. Finally the apt relaxed, sighing, as with the passing of a bad dream, and resumed the regular respiration of deep slumber. I planted my raised foot beyond the fierce head, and an instant later had stepped over the beast. Dejah followed directly after me, and another moment found us at the further door, undetected. The carrion caves consist of a series of 27 connecting chambers, and present the appearance of having been eroded by running water in some far-gone age, when a mighty river found its way to the south through this single breach in the barrier of rock and ice that hems the country of the pole. Dejah and I traversed the remaining 19 caverns without adventure or mishap. We were afterward to learn that, but once a month is it possible to find all the apts of the carrion caves in a single chamber. At other times they roam singly or in pairs in and out of the caves, so that it would have been practically impossible for two men to have passed through the entire 27 chambers without encountering an apt in nearly every one of them. Once a month they sleep for a full day, and it was our good fortune to stumble by accident upon one of these occasions. Beyond the last cave, we emerged into a desolate country of snow and ice, but found a well-marked trail leading north. The way was boulder-strewn, as had been that south of the barrier, so that we could see but a short distance ahead of us at any time. After a couple of hours, we passed round a huge boulder to come to a steep declivity leading down into a valley. Directly before us, we saw a half-dozen men, fierce, black-bearded fellows, with skins the color of a ripe lemon. The yellow men of Barsoom, ejaculated Dejah, as though even now that he saw them, he found it scarce possible to believe that the very race we expected to find hidden in this remote and inaccessible land did really exist. We withdrew behind an adjacent boulder to watch the actions of the little party, which stood huddled at the foot of another huge rock, their backs toward us. One of them was peering round the edge of the granite mass, as though watching one who approached from the opposite side. Presently the object of his scrutiny came within the range of my vision, and I saw that it was another yellow man. All were clothed in magnificent furs, the 6 in the black and yellow striped hide of the Orluk, while he who approached alone was resplendent in the pure white skin of an apt. The yellow men were armed with 2 swords, and a short javelin was slung across the back of each, while from their left arms hung cup-like shields no larger than a dinner plate, the concave sides of which turned outward toward an antagonist. They seemed puny and feudal implements of safety against an even ordinary swordsman. But I was later to see the purpose of them, and with what wondrous dexterity the yellow men manipulate them. One of the swords which each of the warriors carried caught my immediate attention. I call it a sword, but really it was a sharp-edged blade with a complete hook at the far end. The other sword was of about the same length as the hooked instrument, and somewhere between that of my long sword and my short sword. It was straight and 2-edged. In addition to the weapons, I have enumerated each man carried a dagger in his harness. As the white-furred one approached, the 6 grasped their swords more firmly, the hooked instrument in the left hand, the straight sword in the right, while above the left wrist the small shield was held rigid upon a metal bracelet. As the lone warrior came opposite them, the 6 rushed out upon him with fiendish yells that resembled nothing more closely than the savage war cry of the Apaches of the Southwest. Instantly the attacked drew both his swords, and as the 6 fell upon him, I witnessed as pretty fighting as one might care to see. With their sharp hooks, the combatants attempted to take hold of an adversary, but like lightning the cup-shaped shield would spring before the darting weapon, and into its hollow the hook would plunge. Once the lone warrior caught an antagonist in the side with his hook, and drawing him close ran his sword through him, but the odds were too unequal, and though he who fought alone was by far the best and bravest of them all, I saw that it was but a question of time before the remaining 5 would find an opening through his marvelous guard and bring him down. Now my sympathies have ever been with the weaker side of an argument, and though I knew nothing of the cause of the trouble, I could not stand idly by and see a brave man butchered by superior numbers. As a matter of fact, I presume I gave little attention to seeking an excuse, for I love a good fight too well to need any other reason for joining in when one is afoot. So it was that, before Thuvan Din knew what I was about, he saw me standing by the side of the white-clad yellow man, battling like mad with his 5 adversaries.